Hi everyone, before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It helps me out a lot and contributes a lot to the channel. Now let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. The morning sky over the Crescent Moon Pack's territory was painted in subtle shades of pink and gold, heralding the dawn of a new day. Within the walls of the Grand Lodge, which stood like a sentinel in the center of the pack's sprawling lands, the air hummed with the promise of celebration. Yet for Seraphina Nightbloom, daughter of the Alpha, that promise tasted bittersweet. This day was meant to signify her transition from adolescence into adulthood, a time-honored tradition marked by a formal ceremony in which all newly of age wolves were recognized by the pack as worthy of taking on the Fang, responsibilities of adulthood. But more loomed on the horizon than just the typical formalities. Seraphina was the Alpha's only child. Born to lead, as her father would often remind her, she had been groomed from birth to stand at the forefront of the Crescent Moon Pack. She had grown up hearing the constant refrain that her destiny was to marry a powerful wolf and unify the alliances that her father, Seraphina Nightbloom, had carefully tended over the years. From her earliest memories, she had been told that her bloodline was a gift, that her duty was to strengthen the ties between her father's pack and others. The daughter of an Alpha was never truly free, her life bound inextricably to the demands of pack politics. On this morning, she walked through the corridors of the lodge with her chin held high, greeting the other pack members with a polite nod. Though barely into her 20s, Seraphina carried an air of quiet strength about her. Her long raven black hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her sharp yet delicate features were reminiscent of her mother. She had inherited her father's piercing gray eyes that could command a room even when her voice remained soft. But beneath her composed exterior, an undercurrent of tension coursed through her veins. She felt it in her fingertips, in the slight tremor in her breath every time she considered what her father expected of her. In just a matter of days, she would be introduced to various suitors from allied packs, wolves of high standing and impeccable reputations. One of these wolves was fated to become her mate if her father had his way. She knew that refusing would not be taken lightly, but her heart was not prepared to accept a life chosen entirely by political design. As she passed the great hall, the open double doors revealed a grand space, adorned with tapestries of the pack's crest and history. The exposed wooden beams overhead, carved with lunar motifs, gave the lodge a timeless, stately feel. A handful of pack members were in the midst of setting up for the day's festivities, arranging chairs and tables while others cleaned the floors to a mirror-like sheen. The entire pack was preparing to celebrate not only her coming of age, but also the communal gathering that took place at the same time each year. She was about to continue upstairs to get ready, when she heard her father's voice ring out from the hall behind her. He was in the middle of giving orders to a cluster of betas, reminding them of the schedule, ensuring there would be no mistakes. Alistair's presence was formidable, even if one could only glimpse it from the corner of the eye. His shoulders were broad, his hair streaked with silver at the temples, and his voice carried the authority born of decades leading the Crescent Moon Pack. He paused when he saw his daughter standing by the doorway. "Seraphina, there you are," he said, and her pulse quickened slightly. His smile was fleeting but warm enough to soften some of the hard edges that he was known for. She stepped forward, returning his greeting with a respectful bow of her head. "Father?" she responded. Her eyes darted to the betas behind him, who were all poised to carry out their duties. None dared speak out of turn in the Alpha's presence. Alistair turned back to his daughter. "The ceremony begins at twilight. You know what to expect, but I want to remind you that this is more than just a formality. The entire pack will be looking to you for guidance from this point on." He hesitated, giving her a long, appraising look. "And, in a short time, we will need to address your future. You have your pick of prospective mates, and I want you to keep your eyes open. Make a choice that strengthens our alliances." She nodded, but her stomach clenched at the weight of expectation. "Yes, father," she said, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Her father's gaze lingered on her. If he suspected her reluctance, he did not voice it. Instead, he gestured for her to be on her way. "Go. Prepare yourself. Show the pack the daughter of an alpha in all her glory today." She left him behind and ventured deeper into the lodge, making her way to her private chambers. Within these walls, she found a measure of solace. Her personal space was filled with the comforting scents of lavender and aged books. Shelves lined with both old tomes and new volumes bore evidence of her quiet love for reading. She had always found escape between the pages of historical records, legends, and stories of wolves far away, living lives of unbridled freedom. Her personal sanctuary, though modest compared to the rest of the lodge, was hers alone. She closed the door behind her and let out a slow breath she had been holding. By her dressing mirror, a ceremonial robe draped over a stand, shimmering with thread woven from silver and black. It was to be her attire during the ceremony. She trailed a finger over the intricate embroidery that depicted the waxing and waning phases of the moon. According to pack tradition, wearing that robe symbolized her acceptance of the pack's blessings and their continued protection. But for Seraphina, it also symbolized the shackles tying her to a life she had never truly chosen for herself. She kept telling herself that she was prepared for this day, for the ceremony and all that followed. But she was soon going to realize that fate had other plans. Deep inside, her wolf stirred, echoing her mixed anticipation and dread. And in that moment, she silently wished for some sign that her life might be guided not just by destiny, but by her own will. Evening descended faster than she anticipated. The last rays of sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the lodge, painting the stone floors with streaks of pale gold. By the time Seraphina emerged in her ceremonial robe, she found the great hall bustling with activity. The entire Crescent Moon pack was assembled, faces lit by torchlight and the glow of scented candles. An air of excitement and reverence permeated the room, a silent testament to the significance of the gathering. Alistair stood at the head of the hall, surrounded by the betas and the Elder Council. Seraphina walked toward them, each step deliberate and measured, with all eyes turning to watch her. In that charged atmosphere, the youngest members of the pack, who had also come of age, stood in line, waiting to receive their official blessings alongside her. Seraphina's heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm. She was the Alpha's daughter, after all, and the pack drew strength from her composure. The ceremony began with a call to their ancestors. An elder, clad in a dark robe, stepped forward and recited a prayer to the moon goddess. Seraphina could feel the collective power of the pack rising, a vibration that buzzed along her skin and crackled through the air. When her turn came, she knelt in front of the elder, head bowed respectfully, and felt a hand upon her forehead. A gentle warmth emanated from the elder's hand, as though passing on blessings from all who had come before. "You stand on the threshold of adulthood," the elder intoned, voice echoing in the hushed silence of the hall. "May you honor your lineage, defend your pack, and uphold the sacred bonds of loyalty. May your path lead you to strength, wisdom, and true unity with the one who will stand beside you." Seraphina swallowed as she heard the mention of the one who would stand beside her. It made her skin prickle. stirring thoughts of a future she had little say in. Still, she kept her head bowed, offering no outward sign of her internal strife. She rose to her feet, carefully controlling her expression. Applause filled the hall, echoing off the high ceilings, and she stepped aside to make room for the others behind her to receive their blessings. The ceremony continued in a blur of moving bodies, whispered prayers, and the steady beat of the ceremonial drums that kept the rhythm of tradition. Each newly recognized adult was given a chance to step forward and offer a formal vow of loyalty to the pack. Seraphina did so as well, words rolling off her tongue with a confidence that belied her misgivings. When it was over, the tension in the air dissolved into celebratory chatter. The rest of the night was a feast. Long tables were set with platters of roasted meats, fresh fruits, and pitchers of spiced wine. Wolves laughed, danced, and toasted to new beginnings. Seraphina joined in, taking her seat beside her father, her posture regal and proud. She accepted the well wishes and congratulations from the pack members who approached. Despite the pleasant veneer, she couldn't shake the sense that her path was already chosen. She scanned the crowd, her gaze flicking past the faces she had known all her life. Almost all were smiling, bathed in the warm glow of torchlight and euphoria. Among them, she recognized Gareth of the Ironpaw pack and Dominic of the Silverleaf pack, two potential suitors who had come to pay their respects. She forced herself to smile politely as they offered flattering comments about her grace and beauty. Their words were the standard pleasantries expected in these social contexts, but behind them lay the unspoken truth. One of these men might soon become her mate if her father's strategy took shape. Still, she did her best to remain courteous, to not let her mind wander to the question that nagged at her. Is this all there is? A quiet resignation filled her, and she excused herself when the opportunity arose. Weaving through the throngs of dancing, feasting wolves, she stepped out onto one of the balconies that overlooked the forest below. The moonlit trees seemed to whisper secrets to the night sky, beckoning her to come closer, to break free from the confines of duty. A soft breeze kissed her cheeks, carrying the scents of pine, damp earth, and distant wildflowers. Far off, she heard the rustle of leaves and the faint howls of wolves who preferred the run to the feast. She closed her eyes, allowing the quiet to settle around her, and tried to imagine a future shaped by her own desires. Though she seldom admitted it to herself, she longed for something beyond the walls of the Crescent Moon Pack's territory, something that would grant her the freedom to choose her own path. That longing pounded inside her chest, but she knew it was a dream that might never become reality. Time passed in that silent reverie, until a familiar presence drew her back. She turned to see her father standing in the doorway, arms folded. His face was partially shadowed by the torches behind him, but she could still see the concern etched on his features. "Are you well?" he asked, stepping closer. She nodded, turning back to gaze at the moonlit forest. "I'm fine. The feast was wonderful. I just needed a moment to breathe." Alistair joined her, his gaze following hers out into the darkness. For a moment, he seemed to share in her quiet longing. Then he placed a hand on her shoulder, its weight somehow both comforting and imposing. "You did well tonight, Seraphina. I'm proud of you." Her lips twitched in a small smile. "Thank you, Father." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We have visitors from several packs this week. It is my hope that you'll find at least one of them to your liking. We need strong allies, and I believe in my heart that you will make a wise choice." "Ah," she remained silent, the reality of her situation pressing heavily upon her. She sensed the expectation behind his words, the unwavering belief that she, as the Alpha's daughter, would do what needed to be done. So she simply murmured, "I understand." Alistair accepted her response with a short nod and left her to her thoughts. Only the rustling of her ceremonial robe in the gentle breeze accompanied her as she closed her eyes once more, a quiet prayer escaping her lips. If she was destined to marry a powerful wolf for the sake of the pack's future, why did her heart resist so vehemently? Her mind drifted through a haze of uncertainty, but at least for that moment, she allowed herself to feel the pulsing tug of possibility, a distant call in the night that stirred her blood and beckoned her toward an unknown path. Days turned into a blur of formalities and meet and greets with potential suitors. Each day, a new arrival sought an audience with Alistair, and then Seraphina was summoned to join them for a walk around the courtyard, or a brief conversation by the hearth. She tried to remain impartial, to see each prospective partner as the possible key to her father's wishes. Gareth, tall and proud, spoke of forging powerful alliances through trade. Dominic, more soft-spoken, outlined how their union could bring peace to a contested border region. Though polite, Seraphina could not help feeling stifled by these encounters. Each man saw her as a piece on a larger chessboard, albeit a valuable one. Their conversations brimmed with talk of territories, pacts, and expansions. Rarely did they ask about our own interests or feelings. Rarely did they speak of anything but pack politics. She found her mind drifting during these chats, her gaze wandering out the window to the forest beyond, to the wide world she had yet to explore. One early afternoon, as she was returning from a particularly dull meeting with an older wolf from the Stormhowl pack, she happened to overhear an argument coming from one of the side chambers off the main hall. The door was ajar, and she recognized her father's voice, tinged with tension. She paused in the corridor, uncertain if she should intrude, but her curiosity got the better of her. Carefully, she leaned closer. "They've been sighted on the outskirts of our territory again," came the gravelly voice of Magnus, one of her father's most trusted betas. "It's the third sighting in 2 weeks. They could be rogues." Her father's tone was grim. "Rogues don't normally linger. They might be scouting, or it could be something more." Magnus grunted. "Should we increase patrols? Maybe send out a search party to find them and drive them off?" A long pause. "We don't want to start a war over an unidentified group, but I won't allow rogues or unaligned wolves to roam so freely near our borders. Double the patrols. If they are sighted again, bring them in for questioning. If they resist, we do what needs to be done." "Ah, yes, Alpha." Magnus's footsteps approached, and Seraphina quickly moved away, pretending to be on her way to her room. Though she had merely caught snippets, the conversation echoed in her mind. Rogues in their territory. She had heard the rumors in hushed voices around the lodge, how these lone wolves were often cast out or chose to live outside pack laws, making them wild and unpredictable. To her father, and to most pack leaders, a rogue was a threat, a sign of unrest that had to be addressed with force if necessary. She tried to forget about it, focusing instead on the pressing matter of her future. But a part of her was intrigued. Why would rogues linger near the Crescent Moon pack? What did they want? She knew better than to get involved, yet a seed of curiosity took root, and it refused to be ignored. A few nights later, unable to sleep, she found herself standing on the same balcony where she had once gazed upon the moonlit forest. The wind rustled the leaves, and her wolf senses caught a faint, unusual smell drifting on the breeze. A smell that was neither familiar nor wholly alien. It was the scent of wolf, but not of her pack. She froze, adrenaline trickling through her veins. Cautiously, She leaned over the stone railing, scanning the tree line. At first, she saw nothing but shadows cast by the full moon. Then, movement. Her sharp eyes picked out the silhouette of a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, standing just beyond the edge of the forest. Even at a distance, she could sense the tension in their stance. Her wolf stirred within her, the primal side responding to the stranger's presence. For a moment, she thought to call the guards, but something held her back. An inexplicable compulsion urged her to move quietly, to see for herself who this stranger was. She wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders and slipped through the corridors, descending a flight of stairs that led to the back entrance. Her heart thumped with each step, and questions swirled in her mind. Was this person dangerous? One of the rogues her father had warned about? Or just a lost traveler? When she reached the edge of the courtyard, she paused by an ancient oak tree. She could still sense that presence, the unmistakable aura of a wolf outside her pack. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear warred with curiosity. She knew she should alert the sentinels, but something about the situation felt oddly compelling, as if the night itself was pushing her forward. Careful to remain concealed by the trees, she stepped out into the perimeter. Leaves crunched under her feet, and the crisp night air caressed her face. The forest hummed with hidden life. She advanced until she stood near the spot where she had seen the figure. A swirl of shadows parted, revealing a man with unruly dark hair and bright, piercing eyes that shone like moonlight. He was tall, his presence quiet yet commanding in its own right. Dressed in simple, worn clothes, he looked nothing like the polished suitors from the allied packs. His eyes found hers with uncanny sharpness, as if he had been aware of her from the moment she set foot outside the lodge. For a moment, neither spoke. The air was charged with something primal, something that neither of them quite understood. She thought she saw his nostrils flare, as though he was taking in her scent. Her own senses went on high alert, capturing the faint trace of forest musk and something else that was entirely him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, almost a growl. "You should not be out here alone." An undercurrent of danger underscored his words, but there was no overt threat in his tone. In truth, it sounded more like a warning. She straightened her posture, determined not to show fear. "You are on Crescent Moon territory. Who are you?" A flicker of amusement crossed his features. "I know where I am. The question is, do you?" Seraphina felt her wolf surge within her, bristling at the challenge. "You have no right to be here. If you are a rogue, my father will not let you roam these parts freely. You should know that." His eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a step closer, though still maintaining a careful distance. "You're the Alpha's daughter, aren't you?" She hesitated, uncertain how he knew that, but not wanting to show weakness. "Yes." A faint smile touched his lips. "Heard about you." Her pulse thumped. She should have called the guards by now, but something held her back. She couldn't tear her gaze away from him. He exuded a raw aura, unpolished and unrestrained by the rigid protocols she was accustomed to. If he was indeed a rogue, his presence here was as forbidden as it was fascinating. Before she could press him further, he glanced past her toward the lodge, where a torchlight patrol was approaching. Quietly he said, "Consider this a warning. The forest is not as safe as it once was. You and your pack should be careful." Then he turned and vanished among the thick shadows of the trees, moving with an almost supernatural grace. Seraphina stood rooted to the spot, heart racing, watching him disappear into the night. When the patrol's torchlight swept across her, she realized they had spotted her. She quickly feigned a casual air, telling them she had merely come out for fresh air. She returned to her chamber, mind whirling with questions she had no immediate answers to. Who was he? Why had he come so close to the lodge? And why had she felt drawn to him despite the latent tension in the air? That night, she lay awake, unsettled by the memory of that brief encounter, haunted by the glittering intensity of his eyes. She sensed that he was no ordinary rogue, but she could not guess the magnitude of the secrets hidden beneath his guarded exterior. Unknown to her, that single midnight encounter was the first step on a path that would soon shatter every expectation she had ever known, one that would force her to choose between the love her heart desired and the pack loyalty she had been raised to hold above all else. The next morning brought a dull ache of restlessness that gnawed at Seraphina from the moment she opened her eyes. She pushed through her usual routines, trying to mask the disquiet behind polite smiles as she greeted pack members in the corridors. Yet her thoughts were consumed by the strange wolf she had met under moonlight. She wanted to tell someone, perhaps confide in her close friend Lily, but a sense of caution stopped her. If anyone knew she had ventured outside to speak to a rogue unaccompanied, the consequences would be dire. For now, she chose silence, unsure how to explain even to herself why she had kept his presence a secret. Throughout the day, she went through the motions of more introductions to allied wolves. She forced laughter at their jokes, accepted compliments with a gracious nod, and all the while she felt the stirring of dissatisfaction intensify. On the one hand, she knew the rational path was to pick one of these suitors, secure her father's approval, and step seamlessly into the future that had been plotted out for her. On the other, she could not shake the feeling that something else, something pivotal, was waiting for her beyond the boundaries of her safe world. Late in the afternoon, she sought a momentary escape by venturing into the old library on the upper floor of the lodge. Dust motes drifted in the rays of sunlight that slanted through tall windows. Shelves of ancient volumes rose from the hardwood floor to the vaulted ceiling, containing the collective history of the Crescent Moon Pack and allied lineages. She strode down the aisles, fingertips trailing across the spines of books filled with pack legends, genealogies, and old treaties. History and tradition lived in these pages, a tapestry that wove her into a lineage she both respected and resented. Her footsteps led her to a corner where she could be alone with her thoughts. She let out a quiet sigh, inhaling the comforting scent of old parchment. This was usually her refuge, but today even the solace of books could not quell her inner turmoil. The sound of light footsteps behind her made her turn. She found Lily, her closest friend, standing by a shelf of herbal compendiums. Lily's blonde hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, and her kind, bright eyes were quick to pick up on Seraphina's mood. They had grown up together, forging a bond that transcended pack hierarchies. Lily offered a gentle smile. "You seem troubled, Sera," she said softly, using the old nickname from childhood. Seraphina fought the urge to pour her heart out on the spot. She had told Lily nearly everything over the years, from petty childhood secrets to her concerns about her father's plan to marry her off. But this was different. She had no intention of lying to her best friend. She simply wasn't sure how to speak of what had happened yet. "I just have a lot on my mind," she replied, offering a partial truth. Lily approached, concern etched on her face. "The suitors?" Seraphina nodded. "Yes, that. And the heavy burden of expectations. Sometimes I wish I could just vanish into the night and not be found until I've had a chance to breathe." Lily frowned in sympathy. "I can only imagine. But you know we're all behind you, no matter what happens. Even your father, in his own way, wants what he believes is best. A tight smile curved Seraphina's lips. What he believes is best doesn't always align with what I feel is right. But thank you, Lily. You've always been a comfort to me. They embraced briefly. When they parted, Lily studied Seraphina's face more closely. I know you too well. Is there something else bothering you? Seraphina hesitated, torn between the desire to share and the instinct to protect her secret. In the end, caution won. Nothing important, just my usual worries, I guess. Lily's eyes searched hers, but finally she nodded, respecting her friend's space. All right, but if you need to talk, you know where to find me. With that, Lily turned and left Seraphina to the silence of the library. She sank into a chair by a small reading table, resting her head against her hand. She didn't want to lie to her friend, but how could she explain her encounter with the rogue without drawing condemnation or swift reprisal? The time would come when she would have to talk about it, but not yet. As the afternoon gave way to dusk, an inexplicable restlessness settled over her. She found herself looking toward the forest through the nearest window, wondering if she might catch another glimpse of that mysterious figure, wondering if he would come again. A part of her, overshadowed by logic, silently hoped he would. That night, Seraphina found herself sleepless once more. After tossing and turning in her bed, she finally yielded to the pull she felt and rose, slipping into a warm cloak over her nightclothes. She moved through the corridors with quiet steps, avoiding the notice of any patrolling pack members. It was reckless, borderline foolish, but her wolf stirred with an anticipation she couldn't easily ignore. Soon she stood again at the threshold where the courtyard met the forest. The moon hung high, bathing the clearing in silvery luminescence. At first she saw only rustling leaves and the flicker of shadows, but then, as if materializing from the darkness itself, he appeared. The same tall figure, hair a little wild, eyes reflecting moonlight. Their gazes locked, and she approached, heart thudding in her chest. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the hush of the night spinning tension around them. Finally, she gathered her courage. Why are you here? A trace of a smirk curved his lips. You left the safety of your lodge to find me, and you ask why I'm here? She stiffened, though her tone lacked its usual authority. You trespassing. My father's men won't be gentle if they catch you. He shrugged in a way that suggested he was used to danger. I've risked worse. There was a moment of silence. Her better judgment told her to send him away, to call the guards, but a spark of curiosity and a sense of kinship bound her to him in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She stepped closer, leveling her gaze at him. You're a rogue. You have no pack. That makes you a threat in our lands. He regarded her with an unreadable expression. Let's just say, I don't see eye to eye with most alphas. Your father's included. She folded her arms. Then why linger here at all? His answer was simple, yet it carried an undercurrent of grief and resolve. I'm looking for something, or someone. Intrigue tingled along her spine. Someone? He paused, not offering further details. Instead, he changed the subject. What about you, Alpha's daughter? Why do you risk being seen with me out here? Shouldn't you be sipping fine wine and charming suitors in that grand lodge? A flash of annoyance crossed her face. Is that what you think of me? Just another pampered daughter of a powerful man? His gaze raked over her, leaving her with the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her defenses. Maybe I see someone who's yearning for something else, who's willing to break her own rules to stand here and talk to an outlaw. She hated how accurate his words felt, even as she lifted her chin defiantly. "I have a duty to my pack. I can't just throw it away." He studied her for a moment, as though weighing her statement. "Duty can be a cage, if you let it, but you know that already, don't you?" She bristled at the insinuation, but deep down, she couldn't deny the truth in his words. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. He met her gaze, a subtle intensity in his eyes. "Call me Killian." She repeated the name under her breath, letting it settle in her mind. A strange sense of recognition fluttered through her, even though she was certain she had never heard that name before. "Killian," she said, feeling her wolf stir at the sound of it. "Seraphina," he countered, as though testing the shape of her name on his tongue. Her heart hammered, an inexplicable warmth flooding her chest at the sound of him speaking her name. In the silent space that followed, she was suddenly aware of how close he was, of the faint scar that trailed across his left cheek, of the well-defined muscles under his tattered shirt. She could smell his scent, wild and alive, an aroma that stirred primal instincts within her. A new sensation surfaced, a fleeting desire to trust him, to confide in him. The realization startled her, for it was madness to trust a rogue who skulked on her father's lands. And yet, the sincerity in his gaze told her he was not here to harm her. Perhaps that alone was reason enough for her to remain still, waiting for him to speak again. But the moment shattered as a howl sliced through the night, a patrolman sounding an alert, likely having caught wind of Killian's presence. She tensed, eyes darting in the direction of the lodge. Torchlights were flickering among the tree line, drawing closer. "You need to go," she hissed at him, stepping back. "If they find you here," he nodded, already slipping into the shadows. "We'll talk again," he promised. And then he was gone. Moments later, two patrolling wolves, both in human form but with heightened senses, broke into the clearing. Their gazes locked on Seraphina. She managed to keep her composure, turning to face them calmly. "Seraphina," one said, a note of surprise in his voice. "We heard something. Did you see anyone?" She shook her head convincingly. "I came out because I couldn't sleep. I heard a howl, but I didn't see anyone. Maybe it was just the wind in the trees." They exchanged uncertain glances, but they would never dare contradict the Alpha's daughter. "We'll sweep the area. You should return to the lodge, my lady," one of them advised. She let them escort her back, her mind still buzzing with adrenaline from the encounter. As she climbed the stairs toward her chamber, she replayed Killian's words in her head, the calm, assured tone that hinted at secrets deeper than mere roguery. She had never met anyone quite like him before, and she was not sure whether to be terrified or intrigued by the sense of connection she felt. Yet as she drifted off to a restless sleep, she could not ignore the new crack that had appeared in the armor of her carefully curated future. Duty and desire clashed violently in her dreams, leaving her with a single question echoing in her mind. Who was Killian really? And why did her wolf feel so alive in his presence? Morning and the crescent moon packed territory arrived with the scent of freshly baked bread and the distant crowing of a rooster that perched somewhere near the stables. Sunlight streamed through Seraphina's window, coaxing her awake from fragmented dreams. She blinked groggily, her heart still pounding from images of moonlit forests and piercing eyes that refused to fade in daylight. For a moment she allowed herself to linger in bed, sorting through the muddled recollections of her late-night meeting. In the rational light of day, the events seemed almost surreal. It was one thing to encounter a rogue wolf who slipped silently among the shadows. It was another to feel so utterly drawn to him. A wave of confusion crashed over her as she dressed for the day, selecting a simple tunic and pants rather than the more formal gowns expected of her. The suitors would no doubt be milling about, hoping to curry favor in the halls and courtyards, but for once, she wanted to keep her attire practical. She intended to take a ride to clear her head. She made her way to the lodge's dining area where her father, Alistair, sat with a small group of pack elders. He lifted his head from a parchment he was examining. "Good morning, Seraphina." His voice was measured, as always, tinged with the subtle warmth he reserved only for her. She bowed her head in greeting, offering a fleeting smile. "Father." A seat had been left for her at the table, but she hesitated. Joining them meant exposing herself to questions she wasn't ready to answer, particularly about her potential suitors. And she feared the elders might pick up on the turmoil simmering in her eyes. "I'm going for a ride," she announced. "I'll be back soon." Alistair gave a curt nod, studying her face. "Very well. But remember, we have visitors from the Ironpaw pack this afternoon. They are eager to spend time with you." She concealed her grimace, replying with a short, "I won't be long," before turning on her heel and leaving. Outside, the day was bright, the sky a crystalline blue, unmarred by clouds. Seraphina walked toward the stables, relishing the feel of the sun on her skin. A stable hand greeted her with a respectful nod, and she asked for her mare, a sleek midnight black horse named Moonshadow. The stable hand saddled the mare quickly, and Seraphina thanked him with a kind word. As she guided Moonshadow past the gates and onto the winding forest path, the burdens of pack obligations felt slightly less suffocating. Leaves rustled in the light breeze, birds chirped overhead, and the rhythmic clip-clop of the mare's hooves provided a soothing counterpoint to her roiling thoughts. She followed a trail that led to a clearing near a shallow creek, a place she sometimes visited to be alone. Her mind circled endlessly around the rogue Killian. Why had he come back? How did he know her name before she'd confirmed her identity? There was a magnetism to him that both excited and unnerved her. Every instinct told her he was dangerous, if for no other reason than the trouble he might cause within her pack. And yet, she could not deny the spark of curiosity that refused to be extinguished. Upon reaching the creek, she dismounted, letting Moonshadow graze on the soft grass. The water gurgled gently as it cascaded over rocks worn smooth by time. Seraphina crouched by the bank, running a hand through the cool current, relishing the simple connection to nature. "You're supposed to be meeting with the Ironpaw wolves, you know." The unexpected voice startled her. She turned swiftly, already bracing for confrontation. A figure emerged from between two thick pines, the noon sun illuminating the angular planes of his face. Her heart lurched at the sight of Killian. He stood with an easy confidence, arms folded across his broad chest. An immediate surge of alarm coursed through her. They were alone, far from the watchful eyes of her pack, and if he had intended harm, she would have already been vulnerable. But his stance was relaxed, his expression more curious than threatening. She straightened, her pulse hammering against her ribs. "How do you keep finding me?" Killian shrugged. "I catch your scent. I follow. It's not all that complicated for a wolf, is it?" She bristled. "You speak as though you've been trailing me for a while." He lifted a brow. "Maybe I have." A heated flush crept into her cheeks, a mix of indignation and an unbidden surge of excitement. "You can't be here. If anyone sees you, your father's patrols are thorough, but not perfect. I know how to evade them," he said, cutting her off. Then, after a moment's pause, his voice softened. "I don't intend to harm you, or your pack." Seraphina took a careful step backward, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. "Then what do you intend?" He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting over the tranquil clearing before returning to her. "It's complicated, but I need information about your pack's alliances, about a particular lineage." She tilted her head, surprise etching her features. "Information? You've put yourself at risk just for that?" "There are things I have to set right," Killian admitted, a quiet intensity lacing his words. "And for that, I need to understand the political landscape, the families involved. Your father is one of the most influential alphas around. He keeps records in that grand library of yours, does he not?" She stiffened, protective instincts rising. "You're after the records?" He held up a hand in a placating gesture. "I'm not out to steal or destroy. I just need to look. But there's no way I can waltz into your lodge without being torn apart by your father's wolves." She considered him more carefully now. The sincerity in his eyes was undeniable, but she couldn't simply volunteer to break her father's strictest rules. "I can't allow you into our territory uninvited. You know that." A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "You really are your father's daughter." She eyed him warily, unprepared for the flicker of disappointment she saw in his gaze. She wasn't sure if she was letting him down or letting herself down. Crossing her arms over her chest, she tried to project a confidence she didn't fully possess. "I can't betray my pack." A tense silence settled between them, fractured only by the gentle babble of the creek. Killian dipped his head in acknowledgement, as if he had expected her answer all along. "I respect your loyalty." She inhaled, uncertain what else to say. The swirl of conflicting emotions made her mind spin. She wanted to know more about him, about what drove him to risk coming here. And, to her dismay, she realized she desired his approval. A small, rebellious voice whispered that she was treading dangerous ground, letting a rogue get too close. Killian backed away. "I won't press you further today, but I'll be around." His departure felt abrupt, leaving her unsettled, wanting to ask 1,000 more questions. She stood there as he melted into the shadows of the forest, her thoughts a tangled web of confusion. The creek continued its gentle song, indifferent to her turmoil. When she eventually remounted Moonshadow, her gaze lingered on the place where he had disappeared. A gnawing sense of regret curled in her chest, along with a flicker of excitement she tried to quell. She had to focus on reality. She was the Alpha's daughter, and she had obligations, not the least of which was a meeting with the ironpaw wolves. Riding back toward the lodge, she tried to collect herself. By the time she arrived, midday was slipping into afternoon, and the courtyard bustled with activity. She caught sight of her father speaking with an older man in ironpaw attire, and from the corner of her eye, she saw Gareth, presumably part of the same faction, scanning the yard. There was no avoiding this confrontation now. She handed Moonshadow's reins to a stable hand and walked with deliberate poise toward the small gathering. Alistair noticed her approach immediately, a hint of relief crossing his face. "Seraphina, there you are. I was just telling Alpha Roland and his son, Gareth, that you would be joining us." Seraphina inclined her head respectfully to the ironpaw Alpha, a tall man with graying hair and striking gold eyes that seemed to take her measure in an instant. "Apologies for my tardiness," she said quietly. Gareth offered a handsome smile, stepping forward. He was tall and well-built, with sandy blonde hair that hung loosely around his shoulders. She knew from hearsay that many considered him a prime candidate for her hand. His lineage was strong, and his pack was known for its strategic cunning. His gaze lingered on her face a touch too long before he spoke. "I hope your morning ride was pleasant." She caught the subtle question in his tone, almost as if he was gauging where she had gone and why. "It was refreshing," she answered neutrally. Alpha Roland cleared his throat, glancing between his son and Seraphina. "The Ironpaw and Crescent Moon packs share many interests, particularly regarding border security. We face increasing rogue sightings, which is why we believe a stronger bond between our packs would benefit everyone. What do you think, my dear?" She glanced at her father, recalling the conversation she had eavesdropped on about rogues. Her mind flickered involuntarily to Killian. Swallowing her apprehension, she gave a non-committal reply. Security is always paramount, especially with so many rumors circulating about rogues and the potential alliances forming elsewhere. Roland exchanged an approving nod with Alistair, as if satisfied that Seraphina was indeed well-versed in pack matters. "Precisely. We believe uniting our packs through marriage would create a powerful front. But of course, that decision rests largely with you and your father." Seraphina masked her discomfort. Though she knew it was coming, hearing the words spoken so plainly still made her heart pound. Gareth offered her an amiable smile. "We have ample time to consider the matter. In the meantime, I'd love to walk the perimeter with you, perhaps see how your patrols are set up. I'm always keen to learn new defensive strategies." She forced a polite smile. "That would be acceptable." Alistair nodded, placing a firm hand on Gareth's shoulder. "Seraphina will show you around. I have confidence she can answer any questions you might have about our security measures." There was an unspoken message in Alistair's words. This was her chance to prove her readiness to take on more leadership responsibilities, and also to assess whether Gareth was a suitable mate. The combined weight of her father's expectations and her own roiling emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Yet she drew herself up, maintaining a facade of calm. "Shall we?" she said, gesturing for Gareth to follow her. They left the courtyard, traversing a cobblestone path that wound around the side of the lodge, past the barracks and the armory. Gareth kept stride beside her, occasionally remarking on a strategic point of interest. She offered explanations about guard rotations, vantage points, and the designated watchtowers. It was a conversation she could conduct in her sleep, so deeply ingrained were these procedures. Yet her thoughts kept drifting to Killian, to the dangerous knowledge that a rogue, who might well have a personal agenda, was prowling somewhere beyond the perimeter. She felt a twinge of guilt for not alerting her father or the patrols, but she rationalized it by telling herself that Killian had shown no hostility, at least not yet. Halfway through their walk, Gareth's tone softened, and he turned the conversation to a more personal note. "I've heard much about your achievements, Seraphina. Your father speaks highly of your leadership potential." She inclined her head in polite acknowledgement. "I do what I must for the pack." He studied her with a thoughtful expression. "And how do you feel about the possibility of forging an alliance between our packs?" She paused near a small fountain that trickled water into a stone basin. 2 stone wolves guarded either side, their features etched with stoic grace. "You're asking if I want to marry a stranger for the sake of politics?" Her directness seemed to catch him off guard, but he recovered quickly. "I understand it's not a trivial matter. We wolves mate for life, after all. But perhaps we're not strangers entirely. There's time for us to learn about each other, to see if we are compatible. Our families see the benefit in our union, but ultimately, the choice belongs to us." She considered his words carefully. Despite her misgivings, Gareth sounded sincere. He was not forcing himself on her. He was extending an offer that he believed was mutually beneficial. Compared to some of the other suitors who only spoke of treaties and battles, Gareth's approach felt more genuine, almost considerate. But she still felt trapped by the notion of a decision that was never truly hers to begin with. After a measured silence, she said softly, "There is much to weigh." He nodded, respect lighting his eyes. "That's fair. If you ever wish to speak without the watchful eyes of our fathers, I'd welcome the chance to know you better." She offered a thin smile, appreciating his attempt at courtesy. "Thank you, Gareth. I'll keep that in mind." They resumed their walk, eventually returning to the courtyard, where Alistair and Alpha Roland were finishing a conversation. The day carried on with more discussions about trade routes, mutual defense pacts, and possible future engagements. Seraphina participated as needed, but her mind rarely strayed from that small clearing by the creek, replaying the sound of Killian's voice. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. That evening, a banquet was held in honor of the ironpaw visitors. Tables groaned under the weight of platters heaped with roasted venison, spiced potatoes, fresh fruits, and an array of pastries. Wine and ale flowed freely, filling the great hall with the hum of conversation and boisterous laughter. Seraphina sat beside her father at the head table, a position that drew numerous toasts and greetings from the guests. She responded graciously to the well-wishers, though the convivial mood only made her feel more isolated. At one point, she excused herself to slip out into the night air, seeking a brief reprieve from the crowd. The moon was bright, the same moon that had been a silent witness to her clandestine meetings with Killian. She stared up at it, feeling an odd longing take root in her chest. She recalled the wild look in his eyes, the sincerity with which he'd spoken. Was he truly dangerous, or simply misunderstood? She doubted her father or any of the pack elders would care about such nuances. Lost in thought, she was startled when someone approached from behind, footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor of the terrace. She turned to see Gareth. He gave her a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not intruding. You seemed a bit preoccupied." She mustered a polite expression. "It's a lot to take in, all these alliances and expectations." He nodded, stepping up to the balcony railing and gazing across the courtyard. The warm glow of torchlight illuminated the silhouettes of the few pack members still active. "I understand. I'm not the heir of my pack, but I hold a high rank, and that alone comes with more responsibilities than many realize. The future feels weighted at times, does it not?" She shot him a sidelong glance, seeing an echo of her own fatigue in his eyes. Indeed. They stood in silence for a moment, as though acknowledging the shared burden of leadership. Finally, Gareth turned to her, sincerity in his gaze. "You may not believe this, but I do not wish to force you into anything. My father sees our union as a strategic move, but I believe in making choices that stand on more than just politics. If there is no foundation of mutual respect and affection, the alliance would be hollow." She exhaled slowly. "I appreciate that you're considering my feelings." He reached out, gently taking her hand. She permitted it, telling herself it was just a polite gesture. "I cannot claim to love you yet, Seraphina, but I do respect you, and I'd like the chance to see if something more can grow between us. So let's not rush. Let's get to know each other, if only to see where it leads." His demeanor was earnest, and she felt a pang of guilt for the swirl of conflicting emotions that stirred in her heart. Killian's face flashed in her mind, unbidden. She told herself it was silly. Killian was a rogue, an outcast, a danger, but she could not entirely banish his memory, nor could she entirely deny the stir of intrigue she felt whenever she thought of him. She extracted her hand gently. "I'd like that," she said, feeling the partial truth of the statement. Gareth's proposal was the rational one, the path that would spare her father's wrath and maintain her pack's strength. Perhaps with time, She could learn to accept such a union, to care for this man who treated her kindly. Yet that night, as she tried to sleep, she found little rest. Dreams danced behind her eyelids, dreams of racing through the forest at night with a dark, imposing wolf at her side. She awoke in a tangle of sheets, breath ragged, the ghost of Killian's presence lingering in her chamber. She pressed a hand to her racing heart and realized with a jolt of shock that she craved something far beyond a safe diplomatic union. In the week that followed, the ironpaw delegation lingered, discussing trade agreements and potential joint patrols with the Crescent Moon elders. Seraphina's father pressed her subtly, reminding her of her duty and the advantages a marriage to Gareth would bring. She remained polite and continued her measured conversations with Gareth, aware that the pack took notice of her every move. Whenever she ventured outside, there always seemed to be a guard or watchful eyes trailing her. During that time, Killian did not appear. She caught no glimpse of him at the forest's edge or near the creek. She told herself it was for the best. The more distance he kept from her territory, the less likely there would be trouble. Yet, as days stretched on, she realized she felt a hollow sense of disappointment. She found herself lingering on balconies at night, scanning the moonlit landscape for any sign of him, her senses attuned to the faintest hint of his scent. By the end of that week, tensions rose when a pack patrol encountered a group of rogues not far from their borders. A brief skirmish ensued, leaving one Crescent Moon wolf injured and the rogues scattering. Alistair was furious, calling an emergency council meeting. Seraphina attended, seated quietly at her father's right hand as the betas and elders deliberated. Magnus, her father's most trusted beta, pounded a fist on the table. "This is the 4th time in recent months we've had rogue trouble. They're testing our defenses. We need to send a clear message." Alistair grimly nodded. "Agreed. I will not tolerate these incursions. The question is whether they are disorganized rogues or part of a larger force." One of the elders, an older woman with silver-streaked hair named Elder Brenna, cleared her throat. "We must be cautious. If these rogues are allied with any other pack, a retaliatory strike could spark a conflict." The debate wore on, with various pack members voicing their concerns. Finally, Alistair turned to Seraphina. "Daughter, you've studied our alliances and the territorial patterns more closely than most. Any insight?" She swallowed, aware of the weight of responsibility. On some level, she suspected Killian might be connected to these rogue sightings, but she had no proof. And she wasn't sure if he was directly involved or merely passing through. She forced herself to speak calmly. Rogues generally avoid direct confrontations unless they have numbers or a clear purpose. The repeated sightings suggest they have a reason for lingering. We need more information before a full-scale assault." Magnus exhaled in frustration. "So we sit back and do nothing while they pick off our patrols?" Alistair held up a hand. "No. We'll double patrols. We'll also send scouts to track these rogues, but they must remain covert and avoid open conflict unless necessary." Murmurs of agreement rose around the table. Seraphina felt a knot of tension loosen in her stomach. At least her father wasn't leaping headlong into war without more proof. The meeting adjourned with a plan in place. The Crescent Moon Pack would tighten its borders and gather intelligence, while the Ironpaw Pack offered additional support in case of an escalating threat. That night, Seraphina retired to her room early, claiming fatigue. In truth, she needed solitude to process the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She lit a single candle on her bedside table, its gentle flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. The hush of the corridors assured her that most of the pack had settled in. Despite the risk, she found her thoughts pivoting once again to Killian. A reckless impulse beckoned her. She wanted to see him, to hear from him, if he had anything to do with these rogues, or if he knew more about the situation. But how could she possibly seek him out without endangering herself or raising suspicions? She rose from her bed, pacing the room. The hush of the evening was broken by a sudden sound outside her window. A soft rustle, a faint scrape. Every hair on her body stood on end. Her wolf senses flared to life, heart pounding. She crept to the window, pushing aside the curtain. In the courtyard below, she discerned a shape moving with stealth, lingering near a cluster of rose bushes. A figure cloaked in black. Killian. Her breath caught in her throat. Of course he would come under cover of darkness. She debated whether to ignore him or to slip out and confront him. She realized, with disconcerting clarity, that she wanted to see him again. Regardless of the risk, a magnetic pull urged her to open the door, step into the moonlight, and meet him. Quietly as she could, she donned a dark cloak and left her room. She navigated the corridors, relying on her memory of the patrol schedules to avoid any wandering guards. Minutes later, she stepped into the courtyard, the moon overhead only partially visible behind drifting clouds. Her eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light, and she spotted Killian near the garden's edge, apparently studying the lodge's architecture. She drew closer, her voice low. "You're either brave or foolish, coming here." He turned to face her, and once again she was struck by the compelling intensity of his gaze. Possibly both. She exhaled, torn between frustration and relief. "Why have you come?" A flicker of amusement sparked in his eyes. "I wanted to see if you're safe." She stiffened. "Why wouldn't I be?" He took a slow step closer, his presence igniting a tension that vibrated through her entire body. "There's been rogue activity along the borders. Your father's men are on edge. If they suspect me, or anyone like me, they might retaliate." She lowered her voice further, though it trembled with suppressed emotion. "Are you part of these rogue attacks?" A shadow crossed his face. "No, I have nothing to do with that. My reasons for being here are separate." She believed him. She wasn't sure why, but her instincts told her he was being truthful. "Then you need to leave. If anyone finds you, they'll think you're responsible. They might kill you on sight." Killian's jaw tightened. "I can take care of myself." She glanced around, the sensation of being watched prickling at her skin. "You don't understand. My father and the Ironpaw pack are prepared to take extreme measures. If you're caught," his expression softened. "And that concerns you?" She swallowed, her pulse racing. "Whether I like it or not, you've spared me from harm, and you've given me no reason to think you're our enemy." Something sparked in his gaze, a wordless understanding that passed between them like electricity. He nodded. "I won't stay long, but I have to ask, those records in your library, do you have genealogies dating back several generations?" She hesitated, uncertain whether to reveal anything. But she found herself nodding. "Yes. The Crescent Moon Pack is meticulous about keeping history. Why do you need them?" A crease formed between his brows. "I'm searching for evidence of my own lineage. I was born to a powerful family, or so I've been told. But I have no proof. I need to find documents that connect me to my ancestors before others destroy them." Curiosity flickered in her chest, warring with her sense of loyalty. "What family?" A pause. "Shadowfang," he said quietly, glancing away as if the word tasted bitter in his mouth. Shock coursed through her. The Shadowfang pack was nearly a myth among her people, a cautionary tale about a once powerful lineage that fell apart amid betrayal and bloodshed. Many believed the Shadowfangs had been entirely eradicated. If Killian was indeed a surviving heir, it would rock the foundation of pack politics. She stared at him, voice quivering. That pack was destroyed generations ago. There were no survivors. His eyes flashed with a mixture of pain and anger. So they said. But rumors persist. My mother told me the bloodline still carried on, though in secret. She died before she could prove it. Seraphina felt the world tilt under her feet. If Killian truly carried Shadowfang blood, no pack would be safe if he chose to claim his heritage. The Shadowfang name still inspired fear. She searched his face, her heart pounding. And what would you do if you found proof? He leveled her with a gaze that sparkled with determination. Reclaim what was lost, restore the pack that was wrongly destroyed. And if I have to fight the entire werewolf hierarchy to do it, I will. A chill ran down her spine, and yet she saw the anguish etched in his eyes. This was not a simple quest for power, at least not by her reading of him. This was about legacy. Justice, perhaps vengeance for the wrongs done to his ancestors. Seraphina, please, he said softly, stepping closer. I need to see those records. If you help me, I'll leave your territory, and I won't bring any harm to your pack. Her thoughts whirled, torn between loyalty to her father and the empathy she couldn't deny she felt for this rogue who might be more than just a vagabond. She knew the risk in helping him was immense. If her father or the elders found out, her betrayal would shake the pack to its core. Yet she was drawn to Killian's conviction, his pain. Something in her rebelled at the notion of letting such a vital piece of history remain buried. She opened her mouth to respond, but footsteps from the far side of the courtyard jolted them both. They froze, exchanging a glance. A guard on night patrol was approaching, his torch casting flickering light against the stone walls. Instinctively, Seraphina grabbed Killian's wrist and pulled him behind a tall rosebush, pressing a finger to her lips in warning. They crouched in silence, hearts pounding. The guard's footsteps drew closer, halting near the very spot they had occupied seconds before. Seraphina held her breath, every muscle taut. She could feel the warmth of Killian's body, the subtle tremor in his pulse. Another wave of tension flared in her chest, blending fear with an odd sense of exhilaration. The guard lingered, perhaps sensing something amiss. After an agonizing moment, he resumed his patrol, footsteps receding into the distance. Seraphina exhaled shakily, her grip on Killian's wrist loosening. He glanced at her, an unspoken question in his eyes. She swallowed hard, the gravity of the choice before her bearing down with crushing weight. Yet in the madness of that moonlit moment, she found herself nodding, quietly conceding to the impulse that had taken hold of her since their first encounter. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Meet me at the library's side entrance after midnight. I'll let you in." Killian's eyes gleamed with gratitude, and she sensed the raw intensity coiled beneath his calm exterior. Then he nodded, stepping back into the shadows. In a hushed voice, he murmured, "Thank you, Seraphina." And just like that, he slipped away, melting into the dark, as though he had never been there. She stood rooted to the spot for a long moment, trying to steady her breath. The weight of her decision crushed her, yet it was laced with a forbidden thrill. She had crossed a line she'd sworn never to cross, deceiving her father, betraying her pack's secrecy. All for the sake of a rogue whose claim could upend generations of werewolf politics. Turning on her heel, she hurried back to her room, forcing herself to adopt an air of calm in case she encountered any patrolling wolves. Once inside, She leaned against the door, pressing a trembling hand to her forehead. She had just made a promise that could change her life forever, binding her fate to a rogue whose secrets rivaled her father's authority. Sliding to the floor, she whispered into the hush of the dark, "What am I doing?" There was no answer but the steady drum of her own heartbeat, echoing the question that tormented her. She was no longer sure which world she belonged to, the rigid realm of her father's expectations, or the uncharted territory of her growing feelings for the outlaw who claimed an impossible heritage. All she knew was that dawn would break soon enough, bringing with it a day that would test the very core of who she believed herself to be. When midnight settled over the Crescent Moonpack's territory, the lodge seemed to breathe in time with the slumbering wolves within. Guard rotations occurred methodically every few hours, and the corridors were mostly empty, lit only by the occasional torch or lantern. Seraphina felt each minute stretch as she waited for the hour that she had promised Killian. She had paced her room for so long that the rugs had become rumpled beneath her restless steps. Each time she heard a distant footstep in the corridor, her pulse quickened, only to settle when it turned out to be a guard making his routine sweep. She kept a vigilant ear out for the subtle shifts of movement inside the lodge, painfully aware that any whisper, any stray noise, could herald disaster if Killian arrived at the wrong moment. At last, the bells in the distant watchtower chimed midnight. Seraphina's heart thudded wildly, a fusion of apprehension and anticipation. She smoothed the front of her cloak with trembling hands, mentally reviewing the route she needed to take. She had memorized the positions of every sentry and guard posted throughout the lodge, crafting in her mind a path that would minimize the risk of detection. The library's side entrance was rarely used after dark. It was more of a service door, through which caretakers occasionally brought in crates of old ledgers or artifacts. Even so, she had no illusions about how perilous this plan was. A single misstep, a single guard with sharper than usual senses, and they would be undone. Yet she pressed on, compelled by a promise she had given to the rogue who bore the name Shadowfang. She cracked her chamber door open, peered into the hallway, and confirmed that no one was passing by. The corridor looked deserted, its walls hung with paintings of past alphas and intricate tapestries depicting the phases of the moon. Holding her breath, she slipped out and glided along silently. When she reached the first corner, she flattened herself against the wall, recalling that a guard made regular rounds there. Sure enough, she heard muted footsteps approaching. With her heightened werewolf senses, she could distinguish the guard's familiar gait. This one was named Darius, a diligent sentinel who rarely missed details. She forced herself to stay calm, pressing into the shadows until the footsteps faded into a distant corridor. Once certain he was gone, she resumed her journey, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would echo against the walls. Descending a flight of narrow stairs, she spotted the modest wooden door that led to the library's side entrance. She prayed Killian had the sense to wait outside until she opened it from within. Every moment she dallied increased the likelihood of them being discovered. She pressed a palm against the door's panel, eased it open a fraction, and slipped through. A burst of cool night air brushed her face as she exited the lodge. The library's side entrance was no more than a few steps along the building's exterior. The section of lawn here was unlit, thick shrubs pressed against the stone walls. Moonlight illuminated the area in a silver glow. She scanned the darkness for any sign of Killian, only to see him materialize out of the shadows next to a cluster of overgrown vines. He appeared almost ghostly in the faint light, his disheveled hair blending into the blackness behind him, his posture coiled as though prepared to vanish at the slightest hint of danger. The moment she caught sight of him, Relief and trepidation mingled in her chest. She beckoned him forward and, without exchanging a word, led him through the door. The interior corridor that connected to the library was dim and narrow. Seraphina quietly bolted the door behind them, her pulse racing, as though she had committed an unthinkable betrayal. Though the corridor was only lit by a single lantern set in a niche, it felt impossibly bright. She motioned for Killian to follow her, and they moved deeper into the winding passage that curved around to one of the far corners of the library. At the door to the main collection, she paused to listen for any presence inside. Normally, the caretaker locked up at the end of each day, and no one ventured in after hours unless there was urgent business. She heard nothing but the faint hum of silence, so she carefully opened the heavy oak door that separated them from the lodge's central repository of knowledge. Once inside, the library greeted them with a hush that felt alive. Tall shelves stood in perfect rows beneath a vaulted ceiling. The dust of centuries gathered on ancient tomes, while newer volumes were kept near the front. Moonlight filtered through high, arched windows, throwing a patchwork of shadows across the floor. The only movement came from the occasional dust mote swirling in the pale shafts of light. Killian hovered close behind her, his steps soundless as a panther on the hunt. She turned to him, whispering so softly it was barely audible. The genealogies are kept in the far section. The shelves are arranged by family lines, pack alliances, and historic treaties. It might be easier if I help you find what you need. His gaze flickered across her face, gratitude shining there. I never thought I'd make it this far. Thank you for trusting me. His voice was low, matching her hush. With cautious steps, they proceeded deeper into the library, weaving through shelves that towered overhead. Seraphina felt a jolt of nerves each time she brushed against a shelf, and caused the timbers to creak. The building was old, and every small noise seemed amplified in the stillness of night. She silently reminded herself that most of the pack was asleep, and the watchful eyes of her father's guards would rarely think to check inside the library unless they caught a scent. She prayed the thick walls and the breeze flowing through the open windows might obscure Killian's scent. She could only hope that no sentry would stray from his post to investigate. They finally arrived at the eastern wing, where the genealogies were meticulously arranged in bound volumes according to lineage. Leather spines bore the names of families, some of which Seraphina recognized as close allies, others as ancient foes. She located the section dedicated to packs that once existed but no longer held territory. Her heart thumped harder when she saw the row dedicated to the Shadowfang lineage. Though it had been relegated to myth in many eyes, the Crescent Moon Pack kept records of most significant werewolf bloodlines, even those rumored to have been annihilated. Wordlessly, she indicated an entire shelf. Killian stepped forward, his breath uneven as he read the titles of books and scrolls. Some volumes were so old that their covers threatened to crumble at a touch. Even the lettering had faded to near illegibility. Killian's jaw tightened. This moment was more than a simple search for evidence. It was a chance to reclaim the narrative of his life, to anchor himself in a lineage that the rest of the werewolf world believed extinct. Seraphina watched him, struck by the intensity of his determination, the fierce set of his features that bordered on desperation. She caught a glimpse of how much he had riding on this secret quest. He drew out a thick tome that bore the fate inscription, House Shadowfang, a chronicle of lineage and allied ties. Carefully, he placed it on a nearby reading table. By the slant of moonlight cutting through the tall windows, they had just enough illumination to see the pages. Seraphina stayed close, half to provide guidance, half to keep watch. Each page that Killian turned crackled like dry leaves, the old parchment threatening to tear with any sudden movement. In hushed tones, Seraphina began to explain the structure of the genealogies. These records track births, marriages, alliances, and sometimes even internal conflicts. The archivists would update them with notes from official gatherings or from accounts of battles. If there's proof of a hidden heir, it might be documented here, assuming the archivists knew of it. Killian's voice was thick with reverence, as though every letter carried the weight of ancestors long dead. I was told my mother escaped while she was pregnant with me. She claimed that the line was never truly eradicated, just scattered. I need to confirm the branch that might have survived. He flipped to a page with an elaborate family tree scrawled in faded ink. Seraphina leaned over his shoulder, scanning the spidery lines that branched across the sheet. She noted names she recognized from old tales. Gideon Shadowfang, rumored to be the mightiest alpha of his time, one who was said to have formed pacts with witches and shapeshifters alike. There was also Rowena Shadowfang, famed for her healing magic and rumored clairvoyance. She saw references to alliances with multiple pacts over centuries, significant unions, carefully documented. At the margins, there were footnotes that mentioned betrayals, skirmishes, and alliances dissolved under mysterious circumstances. The deeper they read, the more the tragedy of the Shadowfang downfall leapt from the pages, as though a slow unraveling occurred over time, culminating in a final coup that wiped out nearly all survivors. Seraphina could hear Killian's heart pounding, or perhaps it was her own. Page after page contained the story of a family destined for greatness, torn apart by internal betrayals and external enemies who feared the Shadowfang Pack's power. Then they came upon a reference to an unnamed female Shadowfang who allegedly disappeared during the final assault. The scribe who had written the account left a vague note, presumed dead, though no remains were ever recovered. Next to this note was the symbol used by the archivists to indicate disputed or unconfirmed facts. Killian's hand tightened on the edge of the page, knuckles white. "That's her," he whispered harshly, pointing to the line of text. "My mother always said her grandmother escaped, taking her lineage with her. This is the confirmation I was searching for." Seraphina's gaze flicked to his face. In that moment, she witnessed the confluence of hope, sorrow, and fierce resolve in his expression. The rogue's normally guarded demeanor fractured, revealing a man driven by the desperate desire to honor those who had been wronged. The pang in Seraphina's chest caught her off guard. She had expected to feel only dread at the thought of the Shadowfang bloodline returning to stir up trouble. Instead, she felt an unexpected surge of empathy. Killian continued to scan the pages, searching for any direct mention of a surviving line. The old scribe had mentioned scattered rumors of a child or children hidden among distant territories, but details were scarce. It seemed that the archivists themselves had never confirmed the rumors. This left the official record incomplete, labeling the entire family as effectively defunct. Frustration rippled through Killian's frame, but he tried to quell it. Sensing his turmoil, Seraphina rested a cautious hand on his shoulder. He stared at the contact, his eyes flicking from her hand to her face, and for a moment, that tension bled away, replaced by an intimacy that made her heart flutter. "These accounts were written from the Crescent Moon Pack's perspective," she murmured. "There might be more archived in other packs' records, or maybe there are diaries, letters, something more personal that could confirm the lineage." He let out a ragged exhale. "I need absolute proof. If I show up proclaiming myself a Shadowfang heir with just these incomplete records, no pack will listen to me. They'll say I fabricated the entire story." Seraphina wanted to reassure him, but she found herself contemplating the consequences of his success. If Killian did prove he was a Shadowfang, what would it mean for her father's pack, or for the other packs that had long believed the family destroyed? Unity might fracture, or old fears could spark war. She remembered the awe in which the Shadowfang name was once held, as well as the terror it still invoked. Would Killian be seen as a rightful heir, or as a usurper to be eradicated? Though she believed he had no intention of bringing harm to Crescent Moon, the revelations might have a life of their own. She could sense the oncoming storm, the vortex that threatened to consume them both. Even as these thoughts twisted in her mind, she kept her hand on his shoulder, a silent testament to her decision to stand beside him, at least in that moment. "We'll figure it out," she said, voice softer than she intended. He looked up at her with a flicker of gratitude that glowed in the moon's faint light. Before he could respond, both of them tensed as a distant noise echoed through the library. A creaking floorboard, a shiver of movement behind the shelves. Instantly, Seraphina withdrew her hand and spun around, senses on high alert. Killian's stance shifted to readiness, every muscle coiled. They heard the sound again. Footsteps, measured and slow, as though someone was trying to move quietly. Seraphina felt a chill seize her. Perhaps the caretaker had returned for a late errand, or worse, a guard was doing a final sweep. She glanced at Killian, whose gaze darted across the rows of books, seeking a place to hide. Without a word, Seraphina gently closed the tome and pointed toward a recessed alcove near the back of the library where ancient scrolls were stored. It was partially concealed by a tall bookshelf that jutted out. Together, they moved swiftly, footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Once crouched behind the shelf, they strained to hear any indication of who might be prowling around at this hour. The footfalls grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever it was, they were headed toward the genealogical section, the very spot Seraphina and Killian had occupied seconds earlier. Seraphina felt her heart hammering, her body tense with the knowledge that discovery would lead to disaster. She held her breath, praying that no stray scent or drop of sweat would betray Killian's presence. She chanced a quick peek around the edge of the shelf. Her eyes widened in dismay when she recognized the figure. It was Magnus, her father's lead beta, a tall, imposing wolf who prided himself on vigilance. His brow was furrowed, and he carried a small lantern, the flame casting shifting patterns across the spines of old books. He paused at the genealogical table, eyes narrowing on the open volume that Killian had not had time to properly reshelve. Seraphina cursed inwardly. An open ledger in the genealogy section at midnight was a glaring anomaly. Magnus stepped closer, squinting at the volume. Seraphina could almost feel his suspicion. This was not a man who would dismiss such clues without thorough investigation. Any moment now, he might start searching the library for whomever had dared to intrude. She sensed Killian's tension flare beside her. A single confrontation with Magnus would likely end in violence. As much as she respected Magnus, she knew the beta's loyalty to the alpha was absolute. If he realized a rogue was inside the lodge, he would stop at nothing to subdue or kill the intruder. Slowly, Seraphina laid a hand on Killian's arm, urging him to keep still. She motioned for him to stay silent, her gaze intense. If she was forced to reveal herself, it could at least provide a diversion. Enough time for Killian to escape. But that plan came with its own risks. Her father would demand to know why she was here, alone, at this hour, with a genealogical text open to the Shadowfang lineage. The questions would be endless, the fallout immense. Magnus scanned the area, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if testing for unfamiliar scents. The library windows were open, vetting in the breeze, and Seraphina prayed that the circulating air might mask Killian's presence. After a tense moment, Magnus cautiously shut the tome. He ran his fingertips over the cover, eyes narrowed in thought. Then, in a move that had Seraphina's stomach twisting with anxiety, he placed the tome under his arm. Perhaps he intended to report it to Alistair, or keep it for personal review. Either way, he was leaving the genealogical section with what might be Killian's only lead in official records. Seraphina's heart sank, though a part of her was relieved that the beta did not immediately begin searching the rest of the library. With the tome in hand, Magnus turned on his heel and made for the exit. His footsteps receded into the distance. Seraphina waited, forcing herself to count slowly to 50 in her mind. Finally, she deemed it safe enough to move. She gestured for Killian to follow her, keeping low as they slipped between shelves. They reached the side entrance corridor without encountering anyone else. This time, she felt every nerve in her body tingling, the weight of what had nearly happened pressing on her. Outside, the night was calmer, but the tension between them was electric. Killian's expression was set in grim lines. "He took the book," he said, voice hushed. "Without it, how will I prove anything to the rest of the Pax?" Seraphina's thoughts swirled. "We can get it back. I'm sure he won't destroy it. Magnus is cautious, but he won't tamper with pack records without reason." Killian ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched in his features. "We're out of time. If he grows suspicious, your father might suspect a rogue infiltration. Your entire pack will be on guard. It'll be impossible for me to move freely." She knew he was right. Her father's protective nature, coupled with Magnus's diligence, meant security would be heightened even more. The cost of being discovered loomed like a dark cloud over them. "I'll try to figure something out," she said, her tone determined yet uncertain. "In the meantime, I can look for other references, diaries, or lesser-known archives that might help you. But you should stay away from the lodge until I can see what is going on with the genealogical text. If they catch even a whiff of you, they'll act without hesitation." His eyes locked on hers, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were in this together now, bound by a promise that neither could easily break. He nodded, though resignation flickered in his gaze. "I'll stay near the southern edge of your territory. There's a glade there that isn't heavily patrolled. But if things get too dangerous, I might have to run." She swallowed, knowing that if he fled, she might never see him again. The very thought made her chest tighten with an inexplicable ache. "I'll find you," she promised. "As soon as I learn more." They stood on the threshold of the lodge's side entrance, the moon shining down on them. For a moment, Seraphina forgot the weight of her betrayal, forgot the potential cost of her actions. She saw only Killian, the lone wolf who had become both a mystery and a catalyst for everything she had hidden in her heart for so long. In the hush of that charged moment, Killian reached for her hand. She let him take it, his rough palm pressing gently against hers. The simple contact ignited a spark that made her heart pound, a flicker of warmth in a cold, unforgiving night. "Be careful," he murmured, leaning closer as though to memorize the features of her face. "If your father learns you're helping me, his wrath may fall heavier on you than on me." She offered a faint, wry smile. "I know, but I chose this." Their gazes locked, and Seraphina felt the tension of attraction between them, the intangible pull that had grown stronger with each encounter. The moment stretched, filled with the possibility of a forbidden kiss, an acknowledgement of a bond that neither of them fully comprehended. But just as her breath caught in her throat, a distant sound within the lodge made them separate. Reality crashed back in with all its dangers. Killian withdrew into the darkness, melting away into the night, as though he were merely a shadow. Seraphina watched him go, heart clenched with a mix of longing and dread. She could not linger, so she stepped back inside, locking the side entrance behind her, then retraced her path through the corridors with painstaking care. Her thoughts churned ceaselessly about the genealogical text in Magnus's possession, about the precarious future that awaited her if her father discovered her treachery, about the vow she had just made to a rogue who might claim the most feared legacy in werewolf history. By the time she reached her chamber, the night felt heavier, fraught with unseen threats. She slipped off her cloak and crawled into bed, though she knew sleep would evade her. As the hours crept toward dawn, her mind lingered on Killian's warmth, the weight his eyes had softened when they met hers, the shared sense of danger that now tied them together in a knot of intrigue. She had never felt so alive or so afraid. When sunlight finally broke over the horizon, Seraphina rose from her bed with a renewed sense of purpose. She dressed hastily, choosing a simple tunic and dark leggings. She might be the Alpha's daughter, but this morning she was also a conspirator, a keeper of secret truths that could devastate the delicate balance of her pack. She steeled herself and headed down to the main hall to face whatever revelations awaited her. A tense energy crackled in the corridors. Pack members seemed more alert, quietly exchanging words that she could not quite catch. She spotted a sentinel hurrying toward the Alpha's office, carrying a stack of papers. Anxiety churned in her stomach. Had Magnus already reported his findings? When she reached the door to her father's private study, she paused. Voices drifted from within, muffled by the thick wood. She pressed her ear against it, heart pounding, catching fragments of conversation. Alistair's measured tones contrasted with Magnus's sharper edge. Found the genealogy text lying open. Possibly an intruder in the library last night, Magnus was saying. Her father's voice, low with concern, responded. And you suspect rogues? Or one of our own wolves snooping? Magnus let out a frustrated huff. I am not certain. There was no scent I could follow. The windows were open. But why that particular text? Why the Shadowfang records? Silence hung for a moment. Then Alistair spoke again, quieter this time. Shadowfang was eradicated ages ago. Their name is a ghost story. But if someone is stirring up old histories, it could be part of a larger scheme. If it is connected to the recent rogue sightings, Magnus's words cut in, dripping with tension. We cannot dismiss the possibility that a surviving Shadowfang might be among those rogues. It could be an attempt to resurrect alliances or sow discord. I recommend we tighten security further, double the library watch, and question anyone who has expressed unusual interest in ancient genealogies. Seraphina's heart hammered. She had heard enough. Slipping away from the door, she leaned against the wall, inhaling slowly to steady her breath. The entire lodge was on high alert, and she was at the center of it. If Magnus and her father began investigating, they might soon link last night's intrusion with her actions. She had to tread carefully. She considered confiding in Lily, but quickly dismissed the idea. The fewer who knew of Killian's presence, the better. At least for now. Instead, she made her way to the library in broad daylight, heart pounding in time with each step. The caretaker, a wiry, gray-haired wolf named Eamon, was busy dusting the shelves. He offered her a quick bow, then continued his work. She made a show of browsing the volumes on treaties and alliances, occasionally sliding out a book to feign interest, all while discreetly scanning the genealogical section. She found no immediate trace of the Shadowfang tome. As she expected, Magnus must have taken it. She forced herself to remain calm, rummaging instead through other texts that might hold smaller references to the Shadowfang family. She found scattered mentions in a few historical accounts, but most were second-hand retellings of the same tragic end. After nearly an hour, she retreated. Being seen too frequently in this section might arouse suspicion. She spent the rest of the day moving through her typical routines, greeting pack members, engaging in brief conversations with potential allies who roamed the lodge, and attending a training session with the younger wolves. Each passing moment felt heavy with the knowledge that Killian was out there, waiting for her, and that she held the key to his family's hidden past. When dusk rolled in, she slipped away toward the southern edge of the territory, choosing a path that was less traveled. She moved quickly but carefully, pausing every so often to listen for any sign of patrols. The forest gradually thickened, the overhead canopy blacking out the fading daylight, leaving only a dim twilight glow. She recalled Killian's words about the glade, trusting her senses to guide her to that area. An owl hooted somewhere above, and the underbrush rustled with nocturnal life. The crisp scent of pine and damp earth mingled in her lungs as she forced herself to stay alert. It took nearly an hour of navigating faint trails and forging her own way through dense shrubbery, but she finally reached a small clearing encircled by ancient oaks, whose branches seemed to meld together overhead. The grass here was lush, dotted with wild flowers that glowed pale in the twilight. She paused, scanning the shadows for any sign of Killian. A low growl met her ears, and she tensed. Then, from behind a cluster of ferns, the rogue emerged. He wore the same worn attire, his posture guarded but easing the moment he recognized her. His chest rose and fell as though he had been bracing for danger, but a subtle relief lit his features. "I was not sure you would come," he admitted. Seraphina swallowed, forcing a thin smile. "I had to. You need to know. My father and Magnus suspect someone was in the library, and they found the genealogy text open to the Shadowfang lineage. Magnus took it for safekeeping, so it's out of reach." So it's out of reach? She paused, her voice tightening. "They're on the lookout for rogues with connections to Shadowfang. Security is stronger than ever." Killian's expression hardened, and he raked a hand through his hair in frustration. "We hardly had the chance to glean what we needed. Now the text is gone. This may set everything back." Seraphina stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I might still be able to access it if I know where Magnus stored it. I doubt my father would keep it in his personal study. But it may be in one of the restricted archives. And, in the meantime, we can look for alternative records or any personal journals that might reference your family. However, you need to stay hidden. If you are discovered, my father will not hesitate." A wry chuckle escaped Killian, devoid of humor. "I appreciate the warning, though I am well aware of the consequences. But there is more at stake here than just retrieving a book. Proving my heritage is one step. The next is deciding what to do with that proof. I do not want to spark chaos. I only want to restore my family's honor. Show that we were betrayed. Yet, I fear the rest of the werewolf world will see me as a threat, nothing more." Seraphina searched his face. "Is that what drives you most? Honor? Or is there something else? Revenge? A desire for power?" She realized how blunt her question sounded, but she needed to know. She was risking everything for him, and she could not afford illusions about his real intentions. A flash of pain flickered in Killian's eyes. "My mother died alone. My pack was decimated. The entire world believed we were traitors or monsters. I grew up on the fringes, never able to claim who I was. If I wanted power for the sake of dominating others, I'd have attacked your pack or joined the rogues terrorizing your borders. But that is not what I am doing. I seek justice, the truth, to let the rest of the world know that the Shadowfang name was wronged." The earnestness in his voice resonated with her, smoothing away the last edges of doubt she still held. She took another step, so that they stood only a breath apart. "I believe you," she murmured. Her hand lifted, hovering near his cheek, but she hesitated, unsure if such an intimate gesture might cross a line they could never uncross. Killian's gaze flicked to her raised hand. He gently captured it, pressing her palm against his cheek, eyes drifting shut for the barest moment. Her wolf stirred in her core, a primal reaction to the closeness, to his scent mingling with the forest air. She was acutely aware of how dangerously vulnerable this made her, one of the most sought-after she-wolves in the territory, standing in the arms of a rogue who claimed to be a scion of a cursed bloodline. Yet no power on earth could have made her pull away in that moment. He opened his eyes, voice quiet. "I never expected an alpha's daughter to defy everything she knows for the sake of a stranger." The forest around them seemed to hush, as if acknowledging the weight of that confession. Seraphina felt a flurry of emotions swirl, longing, fear, hope, and an almost reckless exhilaration that pushed her heart into a rapid beat. "You stopped being a stranger to me the night we first met," she replied softly, her cheeks warm despite the cool breeze. "I cannot explain why I feel as I do. I only know that turning you away would haunt me for the rest of my life." Her words hung in the air, and for a split second, she saw a flash of raw gratitude in his face. Then, in one fluid motion, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers with the lightest of touches. The world seemed to tilt, and she inhaled sharply, her wolf rising within her as if howling in silent joy. The kiss deepened, fueled by the tension of forbidden desire and the knowledge that they were risking everything. She tasted his urgency, the fierce undercurrent of longing that mirrored her own. A surge of need swept through her, and for that breathless moment, the weariness she always carried, the burdens of duty and expectation, dissolved under the power of that intimate connection. It was Killian who gently broke the kiss first, his breath warm against her mouth. "This is madness," he whispered, though there was no denial in his tone. "If your father finds out, if the Pax discover—" She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against his. "I know, it is madness, but I cannot stop now." When she opened her eyes, her resolve hardened like tempered steel. "We will do this together, carefully. I will look for a way to access the records, or at least discover where they are kept. I will see what else I can learn about the final downfall of the Shadowfang pack. Perhaps I can talk to my father's elders. They are old enough to remember more of the truth than what was written in the official histories. If I learn anything, I will find a way to get word to you here." He nodded, though worry weighed on his features. "Just be wary. Magnus is sharp, and your father is not naive. They will suspect something if you show too much interest in these ancient events." Seraphina's heart fluttered in her chest, partly from the lingering thrill of the kiss, partly from the sheer terror of what she was about to do. "Then I will be subtle. It may take time, but if you can be patient, we might yet find what you need." Killian squeezed her hand in silent agreement. Then, as if compelled by the tenuous peace of the forest around them, he kissed her one more time, this time with a gentleness that made her chest constrict. It was a promise, a fragile testament to what they might share if the world allowed them. But the moment soon passed, and caution returned to their eyes. The pack would be watching, and even the tranquil glade could offer only so much protection. He pulled back, inhaling the night air. "You should go. If you linger too long, they might track your whereabouts. Patrols will be more frequent now." She nodded, reluctant to leave. "Still, she knew he was right. Casting a final glance at him, she memorized the lines of his face under the moonlight, an image she would clutch tightly in the lonely hours to come. Then she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the forest, heart pounding. She wove back toward the lodge, navigating carefully around known patrol routes, always alert for the telltale crack of a branch or the flash of torchlight through the trees. When Seraphina finally slipped back into her chamber, she pressed a hand to her lips, still able to feel the imprint of his kiss. She was flushed with adrenaline, but the weight of impending conflict settled on her shoulders. She tried to tell herself that everything could still be managed. She would discover the truth, help Killian find the evidence he needed, and perhaps reason would prevail among the packs once they knew his story. Yet an undercurrent of doubt gnawed at her optimism. She knew the stigma around Shadowfang, the paranoia that plagued even peaceful packs at the mention of that name. Could reason truly prevail, or would the survival of a Shadowfang heir spark fury that would not be contained? Exhaustion claimed her at last, though restless dreams haunted her throughout the night. She saw glimpses of battles, heard the roar of wolves clashing under a blood moon, witnessed her father's eyes filled with cold anger as he declared her an exile. And lurking behind all those frightening images was a flicker of hope, the memory of Killian's steady presence, and the sense that they were forging a bond the world was determined to shatter. Morning dawned with a muted grey light, the day dragging heavy clouds across the sky. A storm appeared to be brewing, an apt reflection of the turmoil roiling within the crescent moon pack. Seraphina rose early, determined to seek out a conversation with Elder Brenna, the silver-haired matriarch who had served the pack for more than half a century. If anyone might recall the whispers surrounding the final downfall of the Shadowfang line, it was Brenna. Seraphina found her in the apothecary wing, rummaging through jars of dried herbs. A faint whiff of lavender and sage hung in the air, calming yet pungent. Elder Brenna was muttering under her breath about the shortage of certain medicinal plants. When Seraphina appeared in the doorway, the elder looked up and offered a courteous nod. "Child, you are up before the usual bustle. Did you need a remedy?" "Not exactly," Seraphina said, stepping further into the apothecary. "I came to ask about your recollections of the older packs, specifically Shadowfang." Elder Brenna stilled, her wrinkled hands frozen over a jar of basil leaves. She turned to regard Seraphina with sharp eyes. "Shadowfang, you say? That name rarely crosses our lips these days, and for good reason." Seraphina approached slowly, keeping her tone respectful. "I found references in the genealogical archives. The official story says they were wiped out, but I wonder if there was more to it, more than the record reveals." Bretta's expression darkened, and she set aside the jar. "Why you ask such questions now? Has your father commissioned a report on old alliances? Careful not to reveal too much." Seraphina feigned casual curiosity. "There have been rogue sightings lately, and some pack members whispered that the rogues might be connected to Shadowfang's remnants. I only wanted to clarify fact from rumor." The elder studied her intently for a moment. Then her gaze drifted past Seraphina, as though reaching back into a painful corner of memory. "I was only a young wolf when the final blow to Shadowfang was struck. The packs allied against them claimed that the Shadowfang line had become corrupt, dabbling in dark arts, forging alliances with unnatural forces. Many believed that allowing them to persist would endanger all wolves. It was not a unanimous decision. There were those who hesitated, who questioned whether the stories of Shadowfang's evil were fabricated or exaggerated." Seraphina's heart dumped. "So, there was dissent?" Brenna nodded, lips pressed tight. "Yes. But fear can be a powerful weapon, child. The story that spread was that the Shadowfang alphas performed forbidden rituals, that they threatened the stability of all our territories. It is hard to know how much of that was true, and how much was stoked by those who feared Shadowfang's growing influence. Eventually, a coalition of packs marched against them, culminating in a bloody conflict. The Shadowfang stronghold was burned, and nearly all the family perished. Seraphina felt an uneasy chill. Is there any possibility that the accusations were false? That the Shadowfangs were simply too powerful, so the other packs turned on them out of fear? The elder sighed, shoulders sagging with the weight of recollections. Hard to say. Stories can become twisted. I do recall whisperings among our own elders at the time, murmurs about a conspiracy, about certain packs that benefited greatly from the destruction of Shadowfang. Wealth and territory changed hands in the aftermath, but these matters were never openly discussed. It was taboo to question the official narrative. In the end, the survivors, if there were any, vanished without a trace. Seraphina's mind swirled with new insights. Did you ever hear of a child escaping? Some rumor or mention that a pregnant Shadowfang female fled before the final siege? Brenna's brow furrowed. I did hear a rumor once, from a traveling merchant passing through our land. He claimed that a Shadowfang woman had sought refuge far to the north, near the cold mountains, but no one took the rumor seriously. No pack came forward with proof. In those days, it was dangerous to spread claims that a Shadowfang heir lived. You could end up ostracized, or worse. Seraphina absorbed this in silence, her chest tightening. Killian's mother might have come from that very lineage, surviving against the odds. Thank you, Elder, she managed, keeping her voice steady. This helps me understand the history better. Brenna gave her a measured look, eyes narrowing. These are dangerous waters you wade into, my dear. If your father is investigating old rumors, so be it. But if you are poking around for your own curiosity, be mindful. Old secrets can cut deeper than blades. Seraphina acknowledged the warning with a small nod. She slipped out of the apothecary, her heart pounding as she processed what she had learned. The shadows of conspiracy loomed larger than ever, telling a story of possible betrayal that had shaped the werewolf world for generations. If Killian's claim was true, he was the heir to a legacy that had been cast aside, demonized, and possibly destroyed for reasons that were not as clear-cut as the official records claimed. The lines between right and wrong blurred, fueling her determination to see this through. Over the following days, Seraphina tried to pry more details from the older pack members without rousing suspicion. She framed it as research to better understand the history of alliances, citing her father's concerns about rogue threats. Some elders offered only vague recollections. Others cautioned her that dwelling on the subject served no purpose but to revive old nightmares. She persisted, gleaning bits and pieces, references to disputes over territory, accusations of black magic, tensions that escalated quickly when a coalition of packs saw an opportunity to seize Shadowfang's lands. Meanwhile, she kept a careful eye on Magnus. She noticed how he stationed additional guards near the library and the eastern edge of the lodge. When she passed him in the corridors, his gaze lingered just a second too long, as if he sensed she was hiding something. At one point, he questioned her casually about her research habits, wondering why she had shown an interest in ancient genealogies. She pretended it was at her father's request, though she saw doubt flicker behind his sharp eyes. Her father, Alistair, remained busy, convening war councils and discussing strategies to handle the rising rogue activity. Seraphina noticed a new strain in his features. Word of skirmishes on the far borders had filtered in, and a handful of crescent moon wolves had been injured. Each day, tensions mounted. She overheard her father speaking in grim tones about sending a message to the rogues. The mere mention knotted her stomach, for she suspected that Killian's presence might be swept up in the crackdown. 3 nights after her conversation with Elder Brenna, Seraphina slipped away to the southern glade again. She carried in her satchel a few old notes she had managed to copy from lesser-known diaries that mentioned Shadowfang. She also had a small portion of bread and dried meat, concerned that Killian might not have enough provisions while living on the run. She was reluctant to acknowledge the tenderness growing within her, the protective instinct that made her want to ensure his well-being. She arrived at the glade to find it bathed in silvery moonlight. The grass sparkled with dew. She spotted Killian's silhouette against the trunk of an ancient oak. He stirred when she approached, his posture shifting from alert to relieved. She offered a tentative smile, heart quickening at the sight of him. "Any trouble getting here?" he asked, scanning the trees behind her. She shook her head. "I was careful, but the trolls have increased. But I managed to slip through." She showed him the small satchel, handing it over. "Food, and some notes I copied that might be of interest. Nothing definitive, but they reference possible pack alliances that turned on Shadowfang." He eyed the satchel, gratitude plain on his face. "Thank you," he said softly, as though the words were wholly inadequate for what he truly felt. He took out the bread and tore off a piece, handing half back to her. She started to refuse, saying it was for him, but he insisted. They shared a brief meal under the glow of the moon, an oddly domestic moment in the midst of chaos. Once they finished, Killian opened the small sheaf of notes, leafing through the scribbled lines by moonlight. "This might help," he murmured, eyes narrowed in concentration. "If I can show that the packs colluded to destroy Shadowfang out of greed or fear, it could cast doubt on the official story of Shadowfang's malevolence." He looked up, his expression tinged with both hope and concern. "But I still need to present this carefully. If I rush in declaring that the packs lied, they may unite against me again." Seraphina exhaled. "I know. I have been thinking about that as well. I also learned that Elder Brenna was a witness to the final days. She mentioned territory disputes and possible conspiracies. But you are right. The moment you step forward, you could trigger a new wave of conflict. My father hates rogues, and many packs remain terrified of the Shadowfang name." He nodded, frustration etched on his features. "I do not wish to wage war, but if they force my hand, I cannot stand down. Too many died because of falsehoods and betrayal." She reached out, lacing her fingers with his. "We will find a way to do this with minimal bloodshed. If we gather enough evidence, perhaps we can convince a neutral pack or a council of elders to hear your claim. They might arbitrate a peaceful resolution." He cast her a grateful look. "Your faith in me is something I never expected." Then his tone shifted, a shadow crossing his features. "But even if we succeed politically, what then? What about us?" Her heart gave a small lurch. "Us," she echoed, softly. In truth, she had tried to avoid thinking about their future, focusing instead on the immediate dangers. Yet the question lingered like an unresolved chord, pressing on them both. My father, he will insist I mate with a wolf of high standing, possibly Gareth of the Ironpaw pack. He wants a secure alliance. If he discovers I have chosen a rogue, particularly one from the very bloodline he despises, he may threaten to exile me or worse. Duh. Killian's grip tightened on her hand. "I will not allow him to harm you, but I also cannot demand you forsake your pack. If you must choose, I want you to understand that I will not hold it against you if you decide to remain in your home." The very thought stung, a pang of sorrow mingling with her sense of duty. She could not imagine staying behind to be locked into a union she never wanted, but neither could she bear the idea of leaving the family and pack she had known all her life. "I do not want to abandon my pack," she said slowly, "but neither do I want a life dictated by politics alone. I have spent too long following rules that do not align with my heart. For the first time, I feel as though I have a choice, even if it is a dangerous one." She gazed at him, eyes filled with sincerity. "I choose you, Killian, if it comes to that. We will cross that threshold when the time arrives." A flicker of fierce emotion sparked in his gaze, and he drew her close, pressing his forehead to hers. The forest surrounded them, a silent witness to the vow they exchanged in that moment. She could hear the steady beat of his heart, feel the tension in his muscles, sense the swirl of uncertainty that matched her own. Yet in his closeness, she also felt reassurance, a quiet strength that made her believe that perhaps love, even a forbidden love, might be enough to withstand the coming storm. Over the next week, they communicated whenever they could, though each meeting was fraught with danger. Seraphina began discreetly combing through the restricted archives when her father or Magnus were absent. She learned that the genealogical text was locked in a secure cabinet in Magnus's private office, accessible only by him or the Alpha. Frustration dogged her at every turn. However, by cross-referencing other diaries and letters, she compiled a thick sheaf of notes that supported Killian's cause, references to how swiftly land was claimed after the Shadowfang downfall, uncertain eyewitness accounts of so-called black magic that lacked corroboration, and diaries from traveling merchants who claimed the Shadowfang pack was no more violent than others of their era. She kept these documents hidden under a loose floorboard in her chamber, taking care not to leave any trace. Sleep was scarce, as her nights were consumed by quiet planning, and her days filled with the pack's official duties. She noticed Gareth making more overtures, and her father dropping hints that an announcement of her betrothal to Gareth might soon be appropriate. The ironpaw pack was growing impatient, sensing that the alliance needed to be solidified. Each time her father casually mentioned marriage, Seraphina felt the threads of her double life tighten around her throat. Then, late one afternoon, a battered patrol unit limped back to the lodge. Word spread swiftly. They had been attacked by a large group of rogues while scouting near a contested border. Several Crescent Moon wolves were badly injured. One died at his wounds shortly after returning. Alarm rippled through the pack like a contagion. Seraphina saw her father's face pale with anger, his frustration boiling over. He wasted no time calling a council meeting, opening it with a harsh pronouncement that the time for half measures had passed. He wanted the rogues rooted out, driven from every corner of his territory, regardless of bloodshed. Seraphina attended the meeting, seated in a corner, her stomach twisted in knots. She could see the hawkish glint in Magnus's eyes. The betas were murmuring support for a large-scale operation. The ironpaw delegates seconded the motion, volunteering their own warriors. With each word, the noose tightened around Killian's neck. If an all-out hunt was declared, he would be discovered and likely killed, regardless of his true intentions. When her father stood to formalize the plan, Seraphina found her voice, though it shook. "Father, must we act so drastically?" She rose from her seat, ignoring the startled looks from the council. "There may be rogues who are simply unaligned, not actively threatening us. Perhaps a small envoy could be sent to negotiate with any rogues willing to join or respect our territory." Alistair's eyes hardened. We have tried leniency in the past, Seraphina. It is clear these rogues only respond with violence. Would you have us sit idle while our wolves fall? Guilt and desperation warred within her. No, but if we do not at least offer a chance for peaceful resolution, we risk turning them into permanent enemies. More bloodshed could lead to endless retaliation. Magnus scoffed openly. We have already lost good warriors, my lady. We cannot allow them to regroup and strike again. You speak of negotiations, but these rogues have made their position clear. Murmurs of agreement circulated around the table. Elder Bretta cleared her throat, but said nothing, her gaze reflecting sympathy toward Seraphina. Gareth, who was also in attendance, shifted uncomfortably, but did not contradict the pack's call for retribution. Sensing she was losing this battle, Seraphina made one final plea, her voice steady. All I ask is that we allow a moment's pause before unleashing a full-scale hunt. We can send a formal challenge, a last offer for the rogues to disperse or come forward peacefully if they do not respond. Then I will not argue against decisive action. Her father studied her for a long moment, the tension palpable. She willed herself to remain calm, to meet his gaze without betraying the terror she felt for Killian. Finally, Alistair exhaled, though he did not look pleased. Very well, we will send out word. If no rogues step forward to negotiate within 3 days, we proceed. Now let this be the last time we hesitate. Seraphina's heart thumped heavily. She had bought a scant 3 days, a small window that might give Killian a chance. However, as the meeting adjourned and the pack dispersed, she realized Gareth was approaching her, his posture stiff with concern. He drew her aside, voice kept low. That was a brave stand you took. I admire your compassion for the unaligned wolves. But the rest of the pack is not convinced. They see these rogues as killers, not potential allies. She managed a weary nod. I cannot blame them. Blood has been spilled. Still, I cannot help but believe there are rogues who have done nothing to harm us. His gaze flicked to the floor for an instant. Seraphina, if there is more to your words than simple compassion, if you know something about these rogues, please be careful. I would not want you to endanger yourself. He paused, searching her eyes. I respect you deeply. I have no desire to see you hurt or cast out. Her throat tightened. Was Gareth sensing her duplicity, or merely worried about the tension in the pack? I appreciate your concern, she said quietly, but I promise I am only trying to spare unnecessary death. He nodded, though the crease between his brows did not ease. In that moment, she felt a pang of guilt. Gareth had shown her kindness, genuine regard. Yet her heart was entangled with a different man entirely, one whose existence posed a direct threat to the alliances Gareth represented. She hated the looming possibility that she would have to hurt him if she ever found the courage to declare her choice openly. Night brought no reprieve. Seraphina sought Killian in the southern glade again, her mind swirling with the half-formed plan of how to keep him safe. She found him pacing the perimeter of the clearing, muscles tense. When she relayed the outcome of the council meeting, his reaction was as grim as she had expected. This is it, then, he said softly. They will comb the territory, destroy any rogue they find. Unless the rogues agree to some condition of surrender, they will fight back. She swallowed the lump in her throat. They gave 3 days for rogues to step forward or disperse. You can leave. Escape beyond the borders, at least until the hunt is done. A flicker of pain crossed his face. If I run now, I may never have the chance to return. My mother's legacy will be buried forever. All the lies told about Shadowfang will remain unchallenged. But Is that not better than certain death?" She touched his arm gently. "I can try to persuade my father to show mercy if you come forward with your claim, but the risk is enormous. He might see you as a liar, or worse, and if you present yourself as a Shadowfang heir, the entire council might demand your execution. They will not care about reasons. They will only see the threat." A low growl rumbled in Killian's throat. He turned away, glancing at the moon through the gaps in the branches. "You think I should flee?" The conflict in her chest coiled tighter. "I do not want you to die, Killian. There is so much at stake, your cause, your life, and what we have found in each other. But I cannot promise you will be safe if you stay." He turned back to her, frustration and longing etched across his face. "What if I can rally some of the rogues to my side? The ones who only want to live freely, not those who hunger for violence. If we can form a small group, approach your pack not as solitary rogues but as a faction seeking recognition, maybe that would force a negotiation rather than an outright slaughter." Her eyes widened. "That is bold. I cannot guarantee they would listen, but it might be better than lurking in the shadows while the hunt intensifies." Killian's jaw tightened with determination. "I will try, but gathering rogues is dangerous. Some are outlaws for good reason. Others might not trust me. Still, there is nothing else I can do if I refuse to abandon my birthright or you." Warmth rushed through her at those words, at the acknowledgement of how inseparable their fates had become. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You have 3 days to attempt this. I will do everything I can on my end to soothe my father's anger, to push for negotiations instead of extermination. But if the situation grows too dire, promise me you will find a way out. I would rather know you live, even if it means you must vanish for a time." He met her gaze, eyes glowing with emotion. "I promise, but I will fight for a chance to reclaim my legacy, and I will fight for us. If my father's blood runs in my veins, then I will not kneel to anyone who tries to bury the truth." They held each other in the hush of the glade, each minute precious, uncertain. When it was time to part, Killian headed south, planning to scour the fringes of the territory for any rogues who might listen to him. Seraphina returned to the lodge, steeling herself for the inevitable confrontation with her father. The next 3 days threatened to change everything. Either a new path would open for Killian and the remnants of his bloodline, or the wrath of the Crescent Moon Pack would fall like a hammer, crushing any hope for peace. But tension in the lodge grew taut as the deadline approached. Alistair ordered his warriors to assemble at dawn on the 3rd day for final instructions. The Ironpaw pack brought reinforcements, eager to prove their loyalty. Throughout the corridors, Seraphina heard the grim readiness in the voices of the wolves. As they spoke of the upcoming purge, she could hardly breathe, suffocated by the knowledge that Killian might be out there, negotiating with rogues who had no reason to trust him, hoping for a miracle that might avert all-out war. On the final night before the hunts were set to begin, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her chamber. She imagined Killian, possibly in some hidden grove, trying to sway suspicious rogues to his cause. She pictured her father standing in the courtyard at dawn, arms folded in implacable resolve, surrounded by his loyal betas. A wave of desperation surged within her, forcing her to her feet. She dressed quickly and slipped outside, hoping to see Killian at least once more before the storm broke. She reached the southern glade, the moon half hidden by clouds, the air thick with impending rain. But Killian was not there. She called his name in a soft voice, carefully scanning the darkness. No answer came. Her heart squeezed painfully. Was he still trying to convince the rogues, or had he been caught, or decided to flee entirely. She waited nearly an hour, but there was no sign of him. Each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her spin, only to find emptiness and shadows. When she returned to the lodge, dawn was a mere hour away. Her father's wolves were stirring, preparing for the hunts. Exhausted and racked by worry, Seraphina dropped onto her bed, pressing her face into the pillows, as if the darkness could shield her from the horrors to come. A single thought pulsed through her mind. She had done all she could. The rest, for better or worse, lay in Killian's hands. Dawn broke with a leaden sky, rain-heavy clouds blotting out the sun. The courtyard of the Crescent Moon Lodge was awash in the tense energy of wolves preparing for battle. Alistair stood at the head of a large assembly of warriors, his posture radiating authority. Magnus and several other betas flanked him, while Gareth and a group of ironpaw fighters observed with cool focus. Seraphina watched from the balcony above, heart lodged in her throat, as her father addressed the gathered wolves. "Today we end this threat," Alistair announced, his voice carrying over the courtyard. "We have given the rogues every chance to stand down or come forward for peaceful resolution. They have refused. We can only assume they intend more attacks. Let us show them that the Crescent Moon Pact does not tolerate murderers on our lands." A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled wolves. Seraphina flinched at the fierceness in their voices, the raw thirst for vengeance that had been stoked by the deaths of their comrades. She knew that once they were unleashed, it would be nearly impossible to hold them. Trying to keep her composure, she descended the stone steps to join her father, but she hung back slightly, arms folded over her chest as she struggled with her own turmoil. Magnus took the floor next, dividing the warriors into squads, each assigned to sweep a specific segment of the territory. Some squads would venture into the deeper forest, others along the borders, and still others would comb the rolling hills and hidden ravines. The ironpaw wolves would cover the southern edges where sightings had been most frequent. That struck Seraphina like a cold jolt. Killian had mentioned he would be near the southern perimeter. Could the ironpaw wolves cross paths with him before he managed to gather any possible allies? When Magnus finished, Alistair dismissed the warriors with a final admonition. Spare those who surrender, but if they resist, show no mercy. The wolves dispersed, shifting into their roles with practiced efficiency. Armor was adjusted. Weapons, though rarely used by werewolves, unless they fought in human form, were distributed among those who preferred them. Seraphina swallowed hard, searching for Gareth in the crowd. He spotted her and approached, face drawn. "You should remain at the lodge," he said gently. "This will not be a pleasant day." She forced a thin smile. "I am the Alpha's daughter. I should at least be present to oversee any wounded who return." He nodded in approval. "A wise choice. I will try to ensure minimal bloodshed, though I have my orders." Something about the sorrow in his eyes tugged at her guilt. She could only nod in response. Moments later, he joined the ironpaw contingent that set off in a flurry of movement, their footsteps merging with the thunder of the Crescent Moon wolves departing in separate squads. Seraphina stood beside her father, the courtyard suddenly feeling vast and echoing as the warriors fanned out. Alistair noticed her pallor and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It must be difficult to see them go, but you must trust that this is necessary." He paused, his voice turning uncharacteristically soft. "I know you do not relish violence, Seraphina. Neither do I. But sometimes it is the only language our enemies understand." She wanted to protest that not all rogues were enemies, that some merely wandered without pack affiliation and meant no harm. But with the hunt already in motion, her words would do little good. So she swallowed her objections and said, I will help with the wounded when they return." He nodded, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, before striding toward the main gate to oversee the final squad's departure. Seraphina remained rooted to the spot, a sense of helplessness wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. She thought of Killian out there, possibly trying to rally reluctant rogues. Perhaps he was already cornered by an aggressive patrol. The question looped endlessly in her mind. Would he run, or would he stand and fight? As the day wore on, she lingered in the great hall, restless and anxious, prepared to tend to any who came back injured. The storm clouds that had threatened at dawn finally burst around midday, drenching the territory in steady, relentless rain. The dim light turned the lodge's interior into a place of flickering shadows, the torches providing a feeble counterpoint to the gloom. She paced restlessly, occasionally peering through windows at the courtyard, only to find it nearly deserted, the gates wide open as the downpour hammered the stone. Late in the afternoon, the first squad returned. They brought 2 injured wolves, both from a skirmish with a small band of rogues near the northern ridge. The defenders had won, driving off the rogues who fled deeper into the forest, leaving behind the wounded on both sides. A hush fell over the lodge as the healers rushed to tend to the injuries. Seraphina lent her assistance, claiming wounds and offering comfort, but her mind remained fixated on the southern front. Evening came, and the downpour persisted, transforming the courtyard into a muddy quagmire. One by one, squads trickled in, some battered, others unscathed, reporting scattered clashes. The rogues seemed splintered, many running at the first sign of organized resistance. However, no mention had yet been made of the southern squads or the ironpaw wolves. Each hour that passed ratcheted up Seraphina's tension, and more than once she found herself slipping away to a quiet corner to pray that Killian still lived. Nightfall arrived, the storm continuing unabated. With visibility and morale both low, Alistair summoned the pack to regroup inside the lodge's great hall. The squads formed ragged lines, dripping with rainwater, their muddy boots and sodden cloaks leaving tracks across the polished floors. Seraphina stood near the front, eyes scanning each returning face, searching desperately for Gareth's features among the ironpaw wolves. At last they strode in, trailing behind them, 3 captive rogues, wrists bound with silver-laced rope to suppress their shifting abilities. Alistair stepped forward, demanding a report. One of the ironpaw betas, a tall wolf named Baron, replied, "We encountered a cluster of rogues near the southern border. 2 surrendered. 1 attempted to fight. We lost one of our own in the skirmish. The rest fled." He paused, exchanging a glance with Gareth. "We also observed evidence of a larger group further south, possibly meeting in secret, but the heavy rain obstructed our pursuit. We were forced to retreat." Seraphina's heart thudded at the mention of a larger group. Could that be Killian and his would-be allies? She combed the line of ironpaw wolves for Gareth, who stepped forward wearily, face ashen. They moved as if they had some plan, not random attacks, but we could not confirm their numbers or who led them. The territory beyond the ravine was difficult in this downpour. We decided to fall back rather than risk more losses. Alistair glowered, fists clenched. "So they remain at large. We must strike again at first light, storm or no storm. We cannot let these rogues regroup." Seraphina held her breath as she searched Gareth's expression. He seemed troubled, as though something weighed on him beyond simple exhaustion. Then his gaze flicked toward her, and for a moment she thought he might speak to her directly. Instead, he turned back to Alistair, offering only a courteous inclination of his head. The 3 captured rogues were taken to a side room, guarded by 2 crescent moon betas. Alistair dismissed the rest of the assembled wolves, instructing them to rest and prepare for a renewed offensive at dawn. The Ironpaw pack members accepted the hospitality of the lodge for the night, though the atmosphere bristled with tension. Seraphina sensed that a single misstep could spark even more violence. She found Gareth near the great hall's entrance. He had taken off his wet cloak and stood quietly by a torch, brow furrowed. Summoning her courage, she approached him. "Gareth, are you all right?" He turned, surprise flickering in his eyes, before giving her a tired smile. "I am, physically at least, but this junta, it does not sit well with me. We faced rogues who fought only when cornered. The rest fled. I fear many are simply outcasts with nowhere to go." She exhaled slowly, relief at finding someone who shared her misgivings. "I have tried explaining that to my father. He is blinded by the losses we have suffered." Gareth rubbed the back of his neck. "This is none of my business, truly. We are guests here. Still, I cannot help but question the wisdom of an all-out purge. It feels as though we may be missing some crucial piece of the puzzle." He paused, voice dropping lower. "There was a rumor among my men that someone was trying to unify the rogues. We did not see him, but the way a few of them fought, almost organized, suggested a leader. If that is true, your father's forces may be up against more resistance than expected." Seraphina's heart fluttered, a mixture of alarm and hope. Killian was alive then, rallying some rogues. He must have succeeded in persuading at least a handful to band together. But what would happen when Crescent Moon clashed with them again? Gareth continued, tone subdued. "I am not eager to fight more tomorrow, but I have pledged to aid your father. And so I will. If you have any sway over these rogues, any way to broker peace, you should act quickly. Otherwise, more blood will be spilled." He paused, then added softly, "If you need my help, I would hear you out. I may not have the final say, but I can at least try to reason with my father." Her throat felt tight. Gareth's offer was genuine, but how could she explain the truth without incriminating Killian? Or herself? She forced a slight nod, keeping her expression guarded. "Thank you. I will keep that in mind." They parted ways, and she made a quiet retreat from the hall. Unable to bear the tension within the lodge, she slipped outside into the storm, hood drawn over her face. Rain pummeled her relentlessly, but she embraced the discomfort, letting the cold water sting her cheeks. Her wolf senses guided her through the maze of muddy pathways around the lodge walls, until she found a deserted alcove. There, she leaned against the damp stone, catching her breath. She felt trapped, torn between conflicting loyalties, pained by the knowledge that Killian was out there risking everything. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the courtyard. Thunder rumbled, shaking the air. Seraphina closed her eyes, conjuring Killian's face, recalling the fierce warmth of his kiss, the conviction in his voice when he spoke of defending his legacy. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, silently promising that she would find a way to stop this senseless violence before it devoured them both. She did not sleep that night. At dawn, the storm still raged, a great torrent that reduced visibility to a few paces. Alistair and Magnus convened the warriors, preparing for a second day of the hunt. Seraphina braced herself, knowing she had to find a way to intervene. If Killian had truly assembled a band of rogues, they might confront the Crescent Moon forces again. The thought of being idle while Killian and her father battled was unbearable. On impulse, she approached Alistair as he was fastening the straps of his armored vest. "Father, let me ride with you today," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the nerves raging inside her. "I know you planned for me to stay behind, But if there is an opportunity to speak with the rogues, I can help. I have studied the negotiations and laws around unaligned wolves." Alistair regarded her with a stern frown. "I appreciate your offer, but this is not a mere negotiation, Seraphina. We are heading into possible combat. I will not place you in harm's way." She forced herself to speak firmly. "I am not a pup to be coddled. I am your daughter, a wolf of Crescent Moon, and I can hold my own, if I am to lead someday. I should understand the reality of conflict. Allow me to stand by your side. Your men will protect me if battle ensues. All I ask is a chance to prevent more bloodshed." He studied her, measuring the resolve in her eyes. Perhaps he felt a sliver of guilt about shutting her out. Or maybe he recalled the conversation about forging unity among packs. Whatever his reasoning, he finally gave a short nod. "Very well. Stay close to me. If battle erupts, you will remain at the rear." She nodded, relief mixing with dread. It was a calculated risk, but at least this way she would be out in the field, possibly able to sense Killian's presence or intercede if negotiations were remotely possible. They set out in the rain, Alistair's squad forging through muddy trails in human form. Their heightened senses were essential in the reduced visibility, and the wolves near the front took turns shifting to track any scents. The cold rain soaked Seraphina's cloak and plastered her hair to her cheeks. Now and then, she felt Alistair glance her way, ensuring she was still safe, though her mind was 1,000 paces ahead, imagining every possible scenario where she could intercept Killian. A few miles beyond the lodge's perimeter, they encountered signs of a recent skirmish: trampled grass, a fallen tree splintered by some collision, and traces of blood quickly being diluted by the rain. Magnus stooped to sniff the air. They must have clashed here at dawn. Tracks lead further south. He straightened, exchanging a look with Alistair. "We should move quickly." Thunder growled overhead as they pressed onward, pushing deeper into a forest thick with vines and dripping foliage. Despite the oppressive gloom, Seraphina's wolf senses picked up occasional hints of movement at the edges of her vision. Wolves were out there, hidden among the trees. Some might be Crescent Moon patrols, others could be rogues. Her pulse pounded with a mixture of fear and hope that Killian was among them. Before long, they came upon a narrow ravine carved by a fast-running creek, now swollen from the storm. The water churned angrily, and a crude rope bridge spanned the gap. Alistair raised a hand, halting the squad. On the far side of the ravine, shadowy figures moved, their outlines barely discernible in the downpour. Seraphina squinted, trying to pierce the veil of rain. "Who goes there?" Alistair's voice boomed across the ravine, echoing above the rush of water. "Identify yourselves." A moment of tense silence followed, broken only by the pounding rain. Then a deep voice responded. "We are wolves who claim no pack. We want no slaughter. Let us pass freely, and we will leave your territory." Magnus bared his teeth in a snarl. "Lies. You have already attacked our patrols." Shadows shifted on the far bank, and a smaller figure stepped forward. "We defend ourselves because you hunt us like prey. We have nowhere else to go." Seraphina's heartbeat raced. She detected the faintest trace of a scent she recognized, wild and distinct, the echo of the pine and moss Killian often carried. She scanned the group desperately, the storm making it near impossible to see faces. Then, through the sheets of rain, she caught a glimpse of Killian moving among them, speaking in hushed tones to a few rogues. Her heart soared in relief. He was alive. Alistair's voice boomed again. "Any rogue who wishes to surrender may do so. Those who resist will be shown no mercy. Cross that bridge, and you seal your fate." She saw Killian step forward, partially visible now. The shape of his tall frame, the way he held himself, was unmistakable. He shouted across the ravine, "We do not surrender, but we also do not seek to continue this bloodshed. We ask for a parley. Allow us safe passage, or let us speak face to face. There has been enough death." Lightning split the sky, illuminating both sides for a heartbeat. Seraphina could see her father's shocked expression as he recognized Killian from the brief confrontation near the lodge weeks ago. Alistair growled, You were the rogue skulking around my home. You dare show your face now?" A chorus of angry mutters rippled through the crescent moonwolves. Magnus snarled, stepping to the edge of the ravine, hand on the hilt of a short blade used primarily against foes in human form. "You have caused chaos for too long." Killian raised his arms to show he carried no weapon, though in wolf form, that mattered little. "We have no wish to fight you here, but we will defend ourselves if attacked. If you are honorable, meet us in the clearing beyond this ravine, no more than 5 of your best fighters, and we will speak. If we can find a peaceful resolution, we will take it." Magnus spat on the ground. "A trap," he hissed to Alistair. "They want us to wander into their territory, where they can ambush us." Alistair's gaze flicked between the determined rogues and his own warriors. "We outnumber them significantly, Magnus. We could charge across now, but we might lose wolves on that flimsy bridge." Seraphina mustered her courage and edged forward. "Father, let me speak to them," she implored, her voice trembling. "They have asked for a parley. Grant me permission to go with you to the clearing and at least hear them out. If it is a trick, we will have our fighters nearby." A hush fell among the crescent moon warriors. Alistair's eyes bored into his daughter, torn between paternal protectiveness and the logic of her words. Finally, he exhaled through clenched teeth. "Very well. Magnus, gather a few of our strongest. The rest will flank the area. We will not be lured into a slaughter, but we will see if these rogues have anything worth saying." Magnus bristled, clearly unhappy, but he obeyed. Seraphina felt her heart flutter as the group formed. She stood at her father's side, unable to stop her thoughts from racing. Killian was so close. If she could just find a way to intervene, to reveal some portion of the truth that might diffuse this conflict, perhaps they could avoid further bloodshed. The crossing was treacherous. Alistair led the way, stepping carefully on the wet planks of the rope bridge. Rain pelted them, the wind making the bridge sway ominously. Seraphina followed with her breath caught in her chest. Below, the creek raged, ready to swallow any who slipped. She was painfully aware that wolves on both sides were poised to attack at the first sign of betrayal. They reached the far bank, where Killian and a handful of rogues waited. Seraphina recognized some from the ironpaw captives. Others were strangers, their eyes haunted and fierce. She saw how they bore injuries or threadbare clothing, suggesting lives of constant hardship. Yet they stood behind Killian with a grim kind of unity, as though clinging to the only hope they had. Alistair and Killian locked gazes. Tension crackled in the downpool. Killian broke the silence first. "Seraphina Nightbloom, you despise rogues for the harm some have caused your pack. I do not deny that blood has been shed, but we stand here to tell you that many of us did not seek violence. We were forced into it when your patrols hunted us down." Magnus cut in sharply. "That does not excuse the raids or the deaths of our wolves." Killian's eyes flicked to the beta, anger flashing there. "I cannot speak for every rogue in these lands. Some might be dangerous, but do you claim that every single unaligned wolf deserves extermination? We have come to find a new beginning, yet at every turn we are met with claws and fangs." Seraphina moved to her father's side, her voice steady. "Father, if there is a possibility that these rogues can be integrated or allowed safe passage, should we not consider it?" Alistair cast her a guarded look. "And if they betray us at the next opportunity?" Killian took a step closer, ignoring the snarls of Magnus and the others. "That is why we stand before you unarmed. We offer to leave your territory peacefully, or, if you wish, we can negotiate a place for those who want to join your pack. Not all rogues desire isolation. Some yearn for community. And there is another matter." His voice caught, momentarily faltering as he considered how much to reveal. "I am no ordinary rogue, Alpha Nightbloom. My bloodline traces back to the Shadowfang family." A stunned silence followed. The crescent moon wolves behind Alistair exchanged shocked looks. Even in the midst of a raging storm, the hush was deafening. Alistair's face turned stony, his lips curling in disbelief. "Shadowfang? That name was expunged from our world. Do not spit on our intelligence with this lie." Killian's posture was rigid, rainwater streaming down his hair and across his brow. "I have scoured old records, found proof that a Shadowfang heir survived. I bear that blood. I seek to clear my family's name and find a place to rebuild what was unjustly destroyed." Magnus barked a sharp laugh. "Unjustly destroyed." History recalls that the Shadowfang pack delved into forbidden magic, threatening the rest of us with darkness. They brought about their own downfall. Lightning flickered, illuminating Killian's features contorted with anger. "You speak of rumors shaped by those who benefited from Shadowfang's demise. My mother told me that my pack was betrayed, our land seized by those who coveted our power. I have found partial records supporting that claim. If you do not believe me, let me show you. Let me present the evidence before the allied packs, and let them judge whether the Shadowfang line deserves to remain in exile." Alistair's jaw clenched, torn between skepticism and a hint of intrigue. Seraphina ventured forward a step, addressing her father in a tremulous voice. "Father, I have seen references too. There are diaries that question the official narrative of Shadowfang's downfall." Magnus whirled on Seraphina, eyes narrowed. "You have looked into this? Why was I not informed?" She steeled herself, refusing to shrink under his interrogation. "I found the references while researching old alliances. I did not deem them definitive enough to present to the council, but now that I hear Killian's words, it seems there could be truth to them." Alistair's gaze bore into her, a flicker of suspicion. "You have known of this for how long, Seraphina?" She felt her lungs tighten. "Aye, father. I feared you would dismiss it outright, especially given the tensions with the rogues." The Alpha's face darkened, but before he could press further, Gareth and a handful of ironpaw wolves appeared behind Killian's group. They must have circled around, tracking the confrontation. Gareth's eyes darted between Seraphina, Killian, and Alistair. Confusion wove across his expression, followed by a kind of realization that made him inhale sharply. In the midst of that fraught moment, a rogue behind Killian shouted something. The tension snapped. One of the Crescent Moon betas misinterpreted the shout as a signal, and arrows flew from a hidden archer among Alistair's wolves. A rogue screamed, clutching his shoulder, blood mingling with the rain. Chaos erupted. The rogues snarled and attempted to retreat, while the Crescent Moon warriors rushed forward. "No!" Seraphina cried, but her voice was drowned out by the crash of thunder. Killian, fury ignited, lunged to protect the injured rogue, forcing back the nearest Crescent Moon wolf with a snarl that bared elongated canines. Alistair, enraged by the sudden violence, commanded his betas to attack. Magnus roared a battle cry, charging forward to press the offensive. Seraphina was jostled aside as wolves shifted into their forms, fur bristling, or drew weapons if they fought as humans. She stumbled over a fallen bridge, splashing into the mud. Lightning flashed, revealing a scene of swirling conflict. Rogues fought in desperate defense, some battered, others fierce, and the crescent moon wolves attacked with well-trained precision. Gareth and the ironpaw wolves hesitated, possibly uncertain whom to aid in this frenzy, but the momentum dragged them in as well. Killian, in partial shift, swung at a warrior who tried to gut a wounded rogue. Seraphina saw him pivot, snarling with raw power. Her father, spotting Killian, locked eyes with him, rage blazing in his gaze. Seraphina scrambled to her feet, heart hammering. Alistair shifted fully, towering in wolf form, bristling silver fur glinting with rain. He sprang at Killian with lightning speed. Killian spun, claws extended, meeting the Alpha's charge with a bone-jarring impact. They clashed, snapping and growling, water splashing around their struggling forms. Seraphina's pulse thundered as she saw the deadly seriousness in her father's eyes. If Killian lost, there would be no mercy. Desperate to stop them, Seraphina darted forward, ignoring the danger. Wolves clashed all around her, but she zeroed in on her father and Killian. "Father, stop!" she screamed over the din. "This will solve nothing." Yet her words drowned in the cacophony of thunder and snarls. Alistair pinned Killian down for a moment, fangs snapping at his throat. Killian twisted free in a slick tumble, planting a solid kick to Alistair's flank, sending him skidding through the mud. Both shifted back to human form, perhaps to gain better control, or to speak. They circled each other, chest heaving, mud and rain obscuring their features. Alistair's voice was harsh. "Shadowfang scum. You dare claim we destroyed you unjustly? Your ancestors were butchers. The world is better off without your kind." Killian bared his teeth in a snarl, eyes burning with intensity. "I have seen the record of your ancestors. Some stood to gain from our downfall. Lies have fed your hatred. But if you want me dead, then end this now. I will not cower." They lunged again, grappling with inhuman strength. Seraphina cried out, trying to break through the melee. Nearby, Gareth fought off a rogue, but his gaze flickered to her with concern. Everywhere, violence reigned. Lightning cast frantic shadows of wolves entangled in a deadly dance. Blood tainted the air, and the creek roared with the added fury of fresh rainfall. Finally, Seraphina managed to push through, hurling herself between Alistair and Killian right as they prepared for another clash. She skidded in the mud, arms outstretched. "Stop this!" she screamed, voice cracking. "I will not let you kill each other." Alistair hesitated for the briefest moment, horror dawning in his eyes that his daughter stood in the path of his strike. Killian, too, froze, his chest heaving. In that moment of stunned inaction, Gareth appeared at Seraphina's side, trying to restrain her. "Seraphina, you will be killed. Move." She refused to budge, meeting her father's gaze. "If you must end this with blood, then spill mine first." Rain hammered her face, tears mingling with the storm. "I love him," she choked out. "I will not stand aside." Alistair's expression morphed from shock to disbelief. The entire battlefield seemed to pause in that flash of lightning, eyes pivoting to the Alpha's daughter who had, in one raw confession, upended decades of prejudice. Gareth's arms fell from her shoulders as he realized the weight of her words. Killian stared at her, breath ragged, as if the storm itself had quieted for him. The moment hung on a knife's edge. Alistair's face twisted with betrayal and rage. He advanced a step, voice trembling with fury. "You claim to love a rogue? A supposed Shadowfang? Seraphina, what have you done?" Her throat felt tight, but she stood her ground, refusing to cower. "I helped him. I learned the truth about Shadowfang, about how they may have been wronged. I could not watch you lead our pack into more slaughter, Father." Silence fell, broken only by the rumble of distant thunder. Wolves on both sides stood in stunned shock, uncertain whether to continue fighting. Alistair's voice dropped dangerously low. "You have betrayed your pack. You have violated our most sacred rules. All for this?" She swallowed hard, raising her chin despite the tremor in her limbs. "All for love and for justice. If you would kill me for that, then do it now." Magnus stepped forward, face contorted with disgust. "She has sided with the enemy, Alistair. You must punish her or risk the pack losing all respect for your leadership." Her father glared at Killian, who hovered protectively near Seraphina. In that moment, Alistair's sense of paternal love warred with the fury of an alpha who felt betrayed by his own daughter. The tension was unbearable. At last he rasped, "You will leave this territory, Seraphina. You are no longer welcome here. And this rogue, if I ever see his face again, I will tear it off." A hush of shock rippled through the Crescent Moon warriors. Seraphina's heart lurched. Exile. It was almost worse than death for an alpha's daughter. She felt tears burning in her eyes. But she lifted her chin, turning to Killian. "Then we go. Now, let us gather any rogues who will follow. We will leave your lands in peace, if you allow us safe passage." Alistair's voice shook with anger. "Take your cursed band of outcasts and be gone. If you ever return, you will be treated as intruders." A shaky exhale escaped Seraphina. She realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She was severed from the only home she had ever known. She turned to Gareth, whose stunned eyes held a swirl of disbelief and heartbreak. She offered a silent, regretful glance, unable to form the words to apologize for the shattered alliance, the future that would never be. Then she clutched Killian's hand, the one solid anchor in a world spinning off its axis. The rogues, bloodied and exhausted, gathered around Killian, seeing a glimmer of hope in the Alpha's forced truce. A handful of Crescent Moon warriors parted to let them pass, though some snarled in contempt. Seraphina's heart pounded as she left behind her father, who stood rigid in the mud, refusing to meet her gaze again. The storm slackened to a cold drizzle as they crossed back over the ravine. Up on the far bank, Killian and Seraphina paused to look back at the land that had once been her birthright. Wolves milled in confusion, Alistair roared commands, and Gareth hung his head in silent acceptance of what had transpired. The scene carved a permanent scar in Seraphina's memory. Then, with a heavy sigh, she turned away, stepping forward into the unknown. She and Killian led the ragged band of rogues further south, forging a path through the sodden forest. Each step echoed the finality of her choice. She was no longer Seraphina Nightbloom of the Crescent Moon Pack. She was simply Seraphina, exiled daughter, guided only by her determination to stand beside the wolf she should never have loved and the battered souls who followed him. The journey was harsh, the rain unceasing, their wounds and fatigue pressing heavily. Seraphina moved among the rogues, offering what meager help she could, her limited knowledge of healing herbs gleaned from Elder Brenna's lessons. Killian supported those too weak to walk on their own, his expression etched with sorrow at the cost of a victory that was barely a victory at all. Days blurred together as they traversed unfamiliar lands, heading toward the distant mountains rumored to offer shelter to exiled wolves. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and exhaustion tugged at every limb. Yet, in the heart of that adversity, Seraphina found moments of solace, fleeting but precious. The press of Killian's hand in hers, a tired smile exchanged when they managed to catch a rabbit for supper, the quiet gratitude of a rogue mother whose pup Seraphina helped nurse back to health. Gradually, the storms gave way to calmer skies, revealing a range of rugged peaks in the distance. The air turned crisper, carrying scents of pine and distant snow. Some of the rogues spoke of hidden valleys near those mountains, places where unaligned wolves sometimes built makeshift communities. Each day, they encountered new challenges, territorial predators, scarce resources, the persistent ache of old wounds. But at least they were free from the immediate threat of crescent moon patrols. Despite the hardships, Killian began to talk about the future. "We can form something new," he told Seraphina one night, as they huddled around a small fire. "A pack that does not cling to old hatreds or cast out those without rank. We can stand on truth and let each wolf prove themselves by their deeds, not their birth." Seraphina, wrapped in a cloak still damp from the previous day's rain, gazed at him across the dancing flames. "My father would call that a child's dream," she said softly. "But I believe in it too. The old hierarchies are strangling us. Perhaps we can be the beginning of change." He reached across the fire, capturing her hand. "You sacrificed everything for me, for us. I promise we will build a home worthy of that sacrifice. The world may never accept the name Shadowfang, but we can rename our future." Her heart clenched with emotion. She recalled the final look on Alistair's face, the heartbreak of her friend Lily, and even the confusion in Gareth's eyes. It was a heavy burden to carry, but at that moment, Killian's touch grounded her. "We will shape our own legacy," she murmured. Together, they did not speak of marriage or formal mateship yet. The wounds were too raw, the scars of the Exodus too fresh. But each passing day forged a deeper bond between them, a bond that transcended the labels of rogue or alpha's daughter. Their shared quest for truth and acceptance fused with a love that had ignited like a spark in the darkest night. Weeks later, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking a secluded valley, they stood side by side. The group of exiles, now calling themselves a fledgling pack, rested below, setting up tents and shelters among the pines. Seraphina's gaze roamed over the blossoming community, a mixture of pride and aching nostalgia. She turned to Killian, her voice quiet. "This is only the beginning, is it not?" He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Yes, we have a hard road ahead. The name Shadowfang may still provoke fear or hatred among many packs, but we also have the chance to prove ourselves, to show that old grudges need not define the future." She nodded, leaning into his warmth. The wind carried the faintest hint of snow from the peaks, but his presence warded off the chill. "I miss my home," she admitted, voice trembling with lingering grief. "I miss parts of it." Lily's laughter, the comfort of familiar hallways, even the library I once haunted. "But I do not regret choosing you. Not for a moment." His response was to hold her tighter, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. They stood there, gazing at the newborn settlement, hearts laden with both sorrow and hope. Above them, the sky began to shift, the clouds parting to reveal a single swath of blue, a promise that the storm had passed, for now at least. Seraphina closed her eyes, envisioning the day when she might stand before a council of packs, presenting the truth that had been obscured by generations of fear and lies. Perhaps the Crescent Moon Pack would remain closed to her. Perhaps her father's rage would never subside. But she resolved that she would never let hatred govern her path. She was more than a piece to be wed for political advantage. She was more than an exiled daughter. She was a wolf with her own destiny, ready to carve out a place where love and loyalty coexisted on her own terms. As the sun broke through, bathing the valley in golden light, Killian turned her toward him. His gaze carried unspoken devotion, a reflection of her own feelings. In that moment, neither of them was rogue or exile. They were simply two wolves who had fought against fate, forging a bond that transcended every rule they had ever known. A gentle smile played on her lips, and she wondered if, in some distant future, their story might become a legend of its own, a testament to forbidden love and the power of truth. She wondered if the next generation of werewolves would speak of them not with fear or condemnation, but with the reverent awe reserved for those who dared reshape their world. In the quiet hush of that mountain wind, she clasped Killian's hand. Their gazes locked, each silently promising that no matter how steep the climb, no matter how fierce the opposition, they would face it side by side. Their hearts beat in unison, echoing the unyielding spirit of wolves forging a new path, guided by hope stronger than any chain of the past, and a love that defied every boundary set by the packs they had left behind.